There is a machine out there in the ruins of Earth that doesn't shoot, doesn't broadcast, and doesn't command. It just rolls, and when it finds you, the last thing you will ever feel is the ground itself splitting open beneath your feet. I put this video together because the ARC Comet is one of those enemies in ARC Raiders that a lot of people are still figuring out. There's not a ton of hard information available yet, and I found that interesting rather than discouraging. What you get instead is behavior, design language, and contextual clues scattered across encounters, and I wanted to pull all of that together into one place. One choice I made when assembling this was to spend more time on the Comet's role within the broader ARC ecosystem, rather than focusing entirely on its combat mechanics. There's a bigger story here about what this machine is and why it exists, and I thought that was worth exploring at length. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The world that the ARC came into. To understand the ARC Comet, you first have to understand the world it operates in, because nothing about this machine makes sense without the context of what happened to Earth before any of us ever loaded into a match. ARC Raiders takes place in a future where the skies are no longer ours. Something came down from above, something mechanical, relentless, and alien in its logic, and it began taking everything. Cities fell, infrastructure crumbled. The people who survived did so by going underground, literally, retreating into subterranean shelters where they built new lives in the dark while the surface became a graveyard of twisted metal and broken architecture. The surface world that you explore as a raider is not just a battlefield, it is a record. Every collapsed building, every abandoned vehicle, every piece of scattered debris tells a story about a civilization that was alive and functioning right up until the moment it wasn't. The speed of the collapse is one of the things that the environmental law in ARC Raiders keeps pointing toward. This wasn't a slow decline. It was an overwhelming event, and the ARC were the cause of it. The ARC themselves are not fully explained in the traditional sense of a video game villain with a backstory cutscene. What the game gives you instead is their presence, their behavior, and the architecture of their machines, and from those things you can start to piece together what they are and what they want. The dominant reading among the community suggests that the ARC are some form of automated or semi-autonomous system, possibly extraterrestrial, possibly something humanity itself set in motion and lost control of. Neither interpretation has been definitively confirmed, which is part of what makes the lore so compelling. What we do know is that the ARC have a clear operational logic. They are not chaotic, they are not random. Every machine they deploy serves a function, and every function serves a larger objective that the game only hints at. The raiders, the players, are people who go up to the surface to scavenge what they can for the communities below. And in doing so, they constantly clash with an enemy that is better resourced, better equipped, and better coordinated than any single human fighter. The surface is divided into zones, and those zones have different concentrations of ARC activity. Some areas are lightly patrolled, others are dense with machines that communicate with each other in ways that suggest a networked intelligence. The Comet exists within this ecosystem, and its placement within that hierarchy is something worth paying attention to before we get into what it actually does. Raiders are tough. That is the premise. These are people who chose to go back up into a world that is actively hostile to them because the alternative, staying underground forever, is not a life they are willing to accept. The gear they carry, the skills they develop, the knowledge they accumulate about ARC behavior, all of that is hard-won. And yet the Comet represents a specific kind of threat that experienced raiders still have to respect. Understanding why requires understanding how other ARC machines work. Most ARC units are direct. They have weapons, they track targets, they attack. The Comet does not work like that. Its method of killing is catastrophic and irreversible, and it sacrifices itself in the process, which points toward a very specific design philosophy that whoever or whatever built the ARC decided was worthwhile. The idea of a machine designed to destroy itself to kill a single target is not new in fiction or in real-world military design. Kamikaze drones exist, suicide bombers exist. The logic is straightforward. If the value of the kill outweighs the cost of the asset, the exchange is favorable. What that tells us about the ARC's valuation of raiders is worth sitting with. To the ARC, a single raider is worth spending a dedicated unit on. That is either a sign of how seriously the ARC take human incursions into their operational territory, or it is a sign that the Comet is cheap enough to produce that losing one doesn't register as a significant cost. Both possibilities are interesting, and both have implications for how we understand the broader ARC strategy on the surface. The world building in ARC Raiders is deliberately restrained. There are no long codex entries explaining everything in neat paragraphs. What you get instead is a game that trusts you to look closely, to think about what you are seeing, and to draw your own conclusions from incomplete information. That approach requires more from the player, but it also rewards more, and it is why deep dives into individual enemies, like the Comet, can yield so much material. The surface itself has gone through multiple phases of ARC occupation. Early in the invasion, the machines seemed focused on large-scale destruction, dismantling the infrastructure of human civilization. Later phases suggest a shift toward consolidation, with certain areas becoming heavily fortified ARC territory, while others are patrolled more loosely. The Comet seems to belong to this later phase, a specialized unit deployed for a specific purpose rather than a general-purpose tool of conquest. Geography matters in ARC Raiders in a way that goes beyond just knowing the map. Certain types of ARC units appear in certain areas, and that distribution is not accidental. The concentration of machines in industrial zones versus residential areas tells you something about what the ARC are interested in. The presence of larger, heavier ARC in certain corridors suggests those corridors are important to protect. The Comet's tendency to cluster near larger ARC units is one of the most significant behavioral notes in the game, and it will come up repeatedly throughout this video. Raiders who have spent significant time on the surface develop a kind of intuition about ARC behavior. They learn to read the signs. A certain sound in the distance means a patrol is nearby. A shift in the light could indicate a scanner is active. These are survival skills built from repeated exposure to danger, and they are passed down through communities as hard-earned wisdom. The Comet disrupts that intuition because it does not behave like anything else. The ARC's design aesthetic is consistent across their machines. There is a visual language to their construction that blends something almost organic with clearly mechanical components, smooth curves next to sharp edges, materials that catch light in unusual ways, movement patterns that feel simultaneously purposeful and alien. The Comet fits this aesthetic while also standing apart from it, and exploring why it looks and moves the way it does is one of the more interesting threads in this entire topic. Before we get into the Comet specifically, it is worth establishing what a normal ARC encounter feels like for context. You are moving through a ruined environment. You spot an ARC unit in the distance, or you hear it before you see it. You assess: how many are there? What type? What is their patrol pattern? What is your best approach? You make a decision based on experience and available information. That loop is core to ARC Raiders as a game. The Comet breaks that loop, not by being invisible or silent, but by operating on a different timeline than other threats. By the time its behavior pattern has fully registered, the situation has already changed in ways that demand an immediate response rather than a considered one. That is its design purpose, and it is extremely effective. The communities underground have developed their own lore about the ARC, stories and theories passed down about what the machines are and why they do what they do. Some of those theories are more grounded in observable evidence than others. Some are mythology born of fear, but all of them reflect the fundamental human need to understand the thing that is trying to kill you, because understanding is the first step towards survival. Raiders who return from the surface carry information back with them, not just supplies and resources, but data, notes on patrol routes, sketches of new machine types, accounts of unusual behaviors. That information gets compiled and shared, and it forms the basis of what the underground communities know about the ARC. The Comet's entry into that shared knowledge base would have been a significant moment because it represented something genuinely new. The first confirmed encounters with the Comet, at least as they can be reconstructed from in-game evidence and community observation, suggest that initial reports were confused. Something that rolls at high speed and then explodes does not fit neatly into established ARC threat categories. It would take multiple encounters, and likely multiple deaths, before anyone had a clear enough picture of the comet's behavior to document it usefully. That process of dangerous discovery is baked into the way ARC Raiders presents its world. You learn by doing, sometimes at great cost. The game does not hand you a manual. It puts you in a hostile environment and lets you figure things out through experience, which mirrors exactly the situation that fictional raiders would be in when encountering a new machine type for the first time. The stakes in ARC Raiders are real in the sense that they are mechanical. You lose your gear if you die. That consequence makes every encounter meaningful in a way that games without permadeath or loot loss consequences often fail to achieve. When you encounter a comet for the first time and it does what it does, you feel that loss in a specific way because you made decisions that led to that outcome, and now you are dealing with the results. That design philosophy, making death consequential, shapes how players interact with the lore. When an enemy kills you, you want to understand it. You want to know why that happened, so you can prevent it from happening again. That desire to understand is the same instinct that drives the fictional raiders in the game's world, and it creates a bridge between the player and the story that is quite elegant. The surface world is not static. ARC activity shifts, new machines appear, areas that were once accessible become heavily guarded. The underground communities have to constantly update their understanding of what is up there and how it has changed. The comet's emergence into the established threat landscape would have required exactly that kind of update, a revision of known information that would have had real implications for how raiders plan their surface excursions. Planning a surface run involves weighing risk against potential reward. The routes you take, the areas you target, the duration of your stay, all of it is calculated against the threat level you expect to encounter. The introduction of a machine like the Comet changes those calculations significantly, because it does not fit the threat model that raiders would have previously been working from. The ARC are not static either. This is something the game's lore suggests without stating directly. The machines appear to adapt, to respond to human behavior in ways that imply some form of learning or updating. Whether that adaptation is autonomous, driven by something like artificial intelligence, or directed by a central command structure, is one of the open questions in the lore that makes the world feel genuinely mysterious. If the comet is a response to something specific, a particular tactic or behavior pattern that raiders developed, then its existence tells us something important about the ARC's capacity to recognize and counter human strategies. That is a deeply unsettling thought if you take it seriously, because it means the enemy is paying attention and adjusting. The underground communities, for all their ingenuity and resilience, are operating with severe resource constraints. Every raider who doesn't come back is a loss that those communities feel. Supplies, skills, experience, relationships, all of it gone. The ARC do not have that problem. They can produce machines, they can replace lost units. The asymmetry of that exchange is one of the most sobering aspects of the world that ARC Raiders constructs. Against that backdrop, a machine designed specifically to kill single raiders becomes almost personal. Not in the way that implies the ARC have emotions or personal grievances, but in the mechanical sense that a resource has been dedicated to the specific task of removing you. That focus is not something most enemy designs achieve, and the Comet achieves it through its very nature. The visual design of the ARC's machines carries meaning beyond aesthetics. Shapes that suggest purpose, surfaces that imply function, movement patterns that encode behavioral logic. Learning to read that visual language is part of becoming an effective raider, and the Comet's design is particularly rich with information once you know how to look at it. We will spend significant time on this in later chapters. For now, the important thing to establish is the world. Ruined surface, underground survivors, raiders who bridge the gap. An enemy that is mechanical, networked, and relentless. Within that context, a machine that rolls, targets, and self-destructs is not just a gameplay mechanic. It is a statement about the ARC's relationship to the surface, to the raiders, and to the question of what kind of threat a single human represents. The answer that the Comet's existence suggests is that a single human represents enough of a threat to warrant a dedicated, self-sacrificing response. That is either terrifying or encouraging depending on how you look at it. The ARC are not dismissing raiders as irrelevant. They are building machines specifically designed to deal with them. That mutual acknowledgement, the ARC recognizing raiders, raiders recognizing the ARC, is the engine of the entire conflict at the heart of ARC raiders. It is a war fought in the ruins of a world that used to belong entirely to humans, and every new machine type that emerges is a new chapter in that ongoing confrontation. The Comet is one of the newer chapters, and it is one of the more interesting ones precisely because of how unusual its approach is compared to everything else the ARC deploy. Most machines want to survive. The Comet does not. That difference matters enormously, and it is worth asking why that difference exists and what it means for the larger story. Surface conditions are harsh not just because of the ARC, but because of what the ARC have done to the environment itself. Infrastructure gone, buildings collapsed or structurally compromised, weather patterns potentially altered by whatever processes the ARC use in their operations. The terrain itself is dangerous, and raiders navigate it knowing that the ground under their feet may not be stable. The Comet's seismic explosion plays directly into that environmental instability. It does not just damage you with the direct force of the blast, it interacts with the already compromised terrain in ways that can be deeply unpredictable. A detonation near a structurally weakened building does not just produce the explosion radius, it potentially brings down walls, collapses floors, shifts debris piles. The Comet weaponizes the environment itself. That design choice, if we can call it a choice, points towards something sophisticated. Either the Comet is smart enough to select detonation points that maximize environmental disruption, or the environments the ARC operate in are already so unstable that any high-energy detonation will produce secondary effects, as a matter of course. Both interpretations are consistent with what we observe. The underground communities live with the constant awareness that the surface is not coming back in their lifetimes. The world they knew is gone, and the world that exists now belongs to the ARC. Raiders go up there anyway, because necessity demands it, and because some of them cannot accept the idea of letting that world go entirely. That emotional dimension underlies every surface run in a way that the game never states explicitly, but always implies. When a Comet kills a raider, it is not just a gameplay death. Within the fiction of the world, it is the end of someone who chose, against all reasonable assessment of the danger, to go up to the surface and try to take something back. That choice is heroic in a way that does not require the word to be used, and the Comet is one of the mechanisms by which the world punishes that heroism. The tension between the necessity of surface runs and the danger they represent is the central emotional engine of ARC raiders. The Comet, as a machine designed specifically to end those runs in the most final way possible, sits right at the heart of that tension, which is why understanding it fully, not just as a combat encounter, but as a piece of lore, feels worthwhile. As we move through this video, we are going to be building a picture of the Comet from multiple angles. We will look at where it comes from in the context of ARC development. We will look at its behavior in detail, how it moves, how it tracks, how it decides to detonate. We will look at what its design suggests about the ARC's assessment of human threats. And we will look at what the community has pieced together from direct encounters with this machine. By the end, the goal is not to have a definitive explanation of everything about the Comet, because the game does not provide that, and neither can I. The goal is to have a richer, more textured understanding of what this machine is and why it matters within the larger story of ARC raiders. That richer understanding changes how you encounter it, and it changes what that encounter means. The world of ARC raiders is one of those game settings that gets more interesting the longer you spend with it. There are layers that are not immediately obvious, and the Comet is one of the places where those layers are particularly visible. Let's start digging. Chapter 2. What the ARC built and why they built it. The ARC's approach to machine design is not uniform, and recognizing that non-uniformity is key to understanding the Comet's place in their arsenal. Some ARC machines are heavy, slow, and durable. They are built for sustained presence in contested areas, capable of absorbing significant damage while continuing to operate. These are your anchor units, the ones that hold territory and act as visible deterrents to raiders who might otherwise be tempted to move through a given area. Other ARC machines are fast and light, designed for patrol and pursuit rather than static defense. They cover ground quickly, communicate with other units in the network, and serve as a kind of early warning and rapid response system. Their individual durability is lower than the heavy units, but their speed and communication capability make them valuable in a different way. The Comet does not fit neatly into either of those categories. It is not heavy, it is not slow, but it is also not a traditional fast patrol unit, because its operational logic is entirely different from what either of those archetypes implies. The Comet is in functional terms a guided munition that has been given legs, or in this case, a spherical rolling chassis. The decision to design a machine around self-destruction is worth examining from a purely engineering standpoint, even a fictional one. Every other ARC machine represents an investment in ongoing capability. Build it once, use it repeatedly. The more powerful the machine, the more valuable that ongoing capability. A machine that destroys itself on first use represents a completely different cost-benefit calculation, one where the value of a single engagement justifies the loss of the entire asset. What that means in practice is that the ARC, or whatever intelligence directs ARC operations, has determined that killing a single raider is worth spending a complete unit. That is not a cheap determination to make. If units are costly, it makes more sense if units are relatively inexpensive to produce. If the raw materials and production capacity exist to generate them at scale without significant strain on ARC logistics. The surface is rich with materials that the ARC seem to use: metals, composites, electronic components stripped from human infrastructure. The ARC's presence on the surface has never suggested resource scarcity. If anything, the density of ARC deployment in certain areas suggests a machine civilization that has achieved a level of industrial throughput that human civilization never reached. Or at least, not in this configuration. If the Comet is cheap to produce, and the ARC can generate many of them, then the self-destruct approach becomes not just acceptable, but elegant. Why keep a unit alive when you can simply make more? Why design for durability when you can design for maximum single-use effectiveness instead? That design philosophy, disposability over durability, is genuinely interesting because it is so different from how humans tend to think about tools. Humans value things that last. We build for longevity by default because we are constrained by resources and production capacity. A society that builds disposable units in volume is operating from a completely different set of constraints. And that difference in constraints reflects a difference in fundamental nature. The ARC are not human, and the Comet is one of the clearest expressions of that difference. The rolling sphere chassis is another design element worth unpacking. A sphere is an interesting choice for a mobile unit because it is simultaneously limiting and advantageous in specific ways. A spherical body can roll over uneven terrain by rotating in any direction. It has no orientation to maintain, no legs to stumble, no wheels to jam. On the rubble-strewn surfaces of a post-ARC invasion Earth, that kind of terrain agnosticism is a significant advantage. On the other hand, a sphere cannot do much beyond roll. It cannot crouch, it cannot climb in the traditional sense, it cannot manipulate objects. For a unit whose sole purpose is to reach a target and detonate, those limitations are irrelevant. The Comet does not need to do anything except roll and explode, and for those two tasks, the spherical form is close to optimal. The speed at which the Comet moves when it has identified a target is one of the most dangerous aspects of its behavior. This is not a slow approach. The Comet accelerates aggressively once it has locked onto a raider, and the time between initial identification and detonation range can be alarmingly short, especially in enclosed spaces where a raider cannot put significant distance between themselves and the incoming machine. That speed is not accidental. The design intent appears to be to minimize the window in which a raider can respond effectively. A slow approach would allow plenty of time to fall back to a safe distance, reload, reposition, call for help. A fast approach compresses that window dramatically, and in some environments it compresses it to near zero. That is, intentional pressure designed to deny raiders the time they need to make effective decisions. The seismic explosion at the end of the Comet's charge is the most spectacular aspect of its behavior, and it is also the most mechanically distinctive. Most explosions in games and in real-world weaponry are primarily air concussive. They produce a blast wave that radiates outward and damages everything within a certain radius. The Comet's explosion is described as seismic, meaning it specifically interacts with the ground rather than the air. A seismic detonation of sufficient force creates ground movement, essentially a localized artificial earthquake. The effects of that ground movement on a human body at close range are severe. The structural effects on already compromised buildings and terrain features are equally severe. And unlike a purely aerial blast, a seismic shock propagates through solid material, meaning that cover, which would protect you from a conventional explosion, may offer less protection against a seismic one, depending on what that cover is made of and how it is connected to the ground. This is one of the reasons that the comet is considered such a significant threat even by experienced raiders. The standard defensive response to an incoming explosive, taking cover, is partially negated by the nature of the explosion. You cannot just duck behind a wall. The wall itself may become dangerous. The proximity trigger for the detonation, rather than a timed or impact trigger, also tells us something about the design intent. A proximity trigger means the comet is designed to get as close to the target as possible before detonating. This maximizes the damage potential, obviously, but it also means the comet has to navigate through any defensive action the raider takes in order to get into range. That creates a specific gameplay and narrative challenge. The comet is designed to absorb punishment on its approach. It needs to survive long enough to reach detonation range, which means it is probably built with that requirement in mind. Whether it has additional defensive capabilities, shielding, rapid movement designed to make it hard to hit, or simply a structure that is more durable than it looks, is worth considering. The relationship between the comet and the larger ARC units it is commonly found near is one of the most behaviorally interesting aspects of this machine. It is not operating independently in the way that some ARC patrol units appear to. It stays close to larger machines, which suggests either a dependency relationship or a tactical deployment strategy. One reading of this proximity behavior is that the comet uses larger ARC units for cover and concealment. A small sphere rolling around near a massive ARC machine is much harder to notice than that same sphere rolling across open ground alone. If a raider is focused on the threat presented by the larger unit, the comet can close distance without being identified until it is almost too late to respond. Another reading is that the comet is networked to larger ARC units and receives targeting data from them. The larger machines, with their presumably superior sensor arrays, identify and track raiders. The comet, which may have simpler onboard sensors, receives that tracking information and uses it to navigate toward identified targets, even in complex environments. This distributed intelligence model is consistent with how networked military systems work. A third reading is purely logistical. The comet, as a self-destructing unit, needs to be deployed in areas where there are raiders to destroy. Larger ARC units are deployed in areas that raiders are known to frequent, because those are the areas worth defending or patrolling. The comet clusters near larger units simply because those are the areas where its function is most likely to be used. All three of these readings could be simultaneously true. Tactical concealment, data networking, and deployment logistics are not mutually exclusive. The comet near a larger ARC unit is simultaneously harder to spot, potentially better informed about target locations, and positioned in an area where it is likely to encounter a target. That combination is effective by design. The question of what triggers the comet's transition from roaming behavior to active pursuit is important for understanding how to survive an encounter with one. The triggering condition appears to be visual or sensory identification of a raider at a certain range. The comet spots you, and then it moves. That transition from neutral patrol to aggressive pursuit has a specific character to it that experienced raiders would learn to recognize, though by the time recognition happens, there may not be much time to act on it. The comet's movement during its roaming phase versus its pursuit phase is noticeably different. During roaming, the comet moves in a way that seems almost casual, drifting near the larger ARC units without apparent urgency. When it identifies a target, the acceleration is immediate and dramatic. That behavioral shift is itself a signal, one that a raider who is watching carefully enough might catch in time to respond. The challenge is that by the time you see a comet moving in the casual roaming pattern near a large ARC unit, you are already in a situation that demands careful management. The large ARC unit is itself a major threat. Managing that threat while simultaneously watching for comets requires a level of situational awareness that not every raider can maintain under pressure. This is part of what makes the comet such an effective addition to the ARC threat ecosystem. It does not replace other threats, it layers onto them. You are already dealing with something dangerous, and the comet is the thing you might miss while you are dealing with it. The timing of the comet's introduction into the game's enemy roster, if we look at it from a development and lore perspective, suggests a progression of ARC tactics. Early ARC threats are more straightforward. Later threats are more sophisticated, more layered, more designed to exploit the habits and strategies that raiders develop in response to earlier threats. The Comet fits this progression as a counter to experienced raiders who have learned to handle conventional ARC combat encounters. In lore terms, this could be read as the ARC learning from their encounters with raiders and developing new tools in response. The machines may be watching, cataloging, and adapting. The Comet might be the ARC's answer to a specific realization that single raiders moving quickly through terrain are an ongoing problem that conventional machines are not fully equipped to handle. The engineering of the ARC's machines, in the context of the game's aesthetics, blends industrial and organic influences in a way that feels genuinely alien. This is not human engineering dressed up to look foreign. It has a different underlying logic, a different relationship to materials and forms, that takes a moment to process when you encounter it. The Comet, as a sphere, is the most reduced expression of that aesthetic. It has stripped away everything except the essential, and what is left is something that moves fast and detonates. That reduction is itself a statement. The Comet is not trying to look impressive or intimidating in the way that larger ARC machines do. It is not built to inspire fear through appearance. It is built to inspire fear through behavior, through what it does, rather than what it looks like. That is a different kind of design choice, and it is one that often proves more effective in practice. Raiders who have encountered comets and survived describe the experience in terms that are consistent across accounts. The initial spotting of the machine near a larger ARC unit, the moment of realizing what is near you, the sudden acceleration when the comet identifies you, the horrifying speed of the approach, the critical decision point, do you run, fight, or find cover? And the detonation, either directed at you or at empty ground if you manage to evade it, leaving a crater where stable terrain used to be. Those accounts build a picture of an encounter that is distinguished by the compression of decision time more than any other single factor. The Comet does not give you the opportunity to think carefully. It forces rapid decisions, and rapid decisions made under extreme pressure are where raiders make mistakes. That is the machine's core function. Not just to kill through its explosion, but to force errors through the speed and finality of its approach. The broader question of why the ARC develop and deploy machines at all, rather than using some other approach to control the surface, is worth addressing briefly. The ARC's reliance on physical machines suggests either an aesthetic preference for mechanical bodies, a practical requirement for physical presence in the environment, or some form of limitation on more abstract forms of force projection. Whatever the reason, the fact that they use machines means those machines can be studied, can be damaged, and can be countered. That is the premise on which all raider strategy is built. The Comet, despite its unusual approach to killing, is still a machine. It can be destroyed before it reaches detonation range. It can be avoided by maintaining sufficient distance. Its behavior can be understood and anticipated. These are the threads that raiders pull on, and they are the threads we will continue pulling on throughout this video. Chapter 3. Behavior in the Field. How the Comet operates. There is a rhythm to how the ARC Comet moves through the surface world, and learning that rhythm is the first step toward dealing with it effectively. During its passive state, when it has not yet identified a target, the Comet rolls in irregular patterns near the larger ARC units it is associated with. The movement is not truly random. It has a quality to it that suggests a search algorithm of some kind, a systematic coverage of area that is designed to maximize the probability of encountering a target. This passive movement is deceptively understated. A sphere rolling slowly near a cluster of large ARC machines does not immediately communicate danger to a raider who has not encountered one before. It is smaller than the units around it. It moves without apparent aggression, and its motion blends into the visual noise of an ARC-occupied area in a way that larger machines do not. This low-profile, passive behavior is almost certainly intentional. The sensory apparatus of the Comet, how it actually detects raiders, is not definitively established by the game's available information, but observations from multiple encounters suggest several possibilities. The most straightforward is a visual sensor, essentially a camera or light detection system that identifies raiders by their heat signature, movement, or silhouette. A second possibility is acoustic detection, picking up sounds that raiders make as they move through the environment. A third is a more exotic option, some form of electromagnetic sensitivity that detects the electronic components of radar equipment. The practical implication of this uncertainty is that raiders cannot be entirely sure what triggers the comet's identification. Moving slowly in cover might defeat visual detection, but not acoustic detection. Keeping electronic emissions low might avoid electromagnetic sensing, but not visual identification. The safest approach, consistent with good radar practice in general, is to assume you are being sensed by every mechanism available and to behave accordingly. Once the comet has identified a target, the behavioral shift is immediate. There is no intermediate state, no cautious approach, or threat assessment. The machine commits to pursuit instantly and completely. That immediacy is one of the more unsettling aspects of its behavior because it removes any ambiguity from the situation. You are not wondering whether the comet has noticed you. When it transitions to pursuit mode, there is no question. The pursuit path is not necessarily a straight line to the target. The comet navigates around significant obstacles, meaning it is processing the terrain between itself and its target in real time and selecting a route that will get it to detonation range as quickly as possible, while actually being physically traversable. That navigation capability is non-trivial and suggests a reasonably sophisticated onboard processing system. What the Comet does not appear to do is engage in complex tactical maneuvering designed to cut off escape routes or coordinate with other units during pursuit. Once it is in pursuit mode, its logic is singular: get to the target and detonate. This single-mindedness is both its greatest strength in terms of speed and commitment, and potentially an exploitable limitation in terms of the predictability it creates. Raiders who have exploited this predictability describe a technique where understanding the comet's navigation logic allows you to direct its path into terrain where it cannot maintain speed, buying enough time to either destroy it or move outside its detonation range. This is not a reliable technique for beginners because it requires a level of familiarity with comet behavior that takes time and repeated encounters to develop. But it demonstrates that the machine, for all its effectiveness, is not unbeatable. The speed of the pursuit approach is calibrated to produce maximum threat while leaving some room for skilled evasion. If the comet were truly impossible to outrun or outmaneuver, encounters with it would simply be death with no counterplay. The design, in both gameplay and lore terms, allows for survival through skill and awareness, which is consistent with how ARC Raiders approaches challenge generally. Death is possible. Death is meaningful. Death is not, however, the only outcome. The question of whether the comet tracks a target that goes out of its line of sight, or whether it loses the target and reverts to roaming behavior, has significant tactical implications. If the comet maintains tracking through terrain and obstacles, escape becomes primarily a matter of outrunning it or destroying it. If it loses tracking when the target is concealed, then breaking line of sight becomes a viable defensive option that changes the encounter dynamics considerably. Observations from raiders suggest that the comet does have some level of persistent tracking beyond pure line of sight, but that it can be confused or disrupted under certain conditions. The specific conditions for disrupting comet tracking are not fully established, which keeps this aspect of dealing with it in the realm of experienced raider knowledge rather than codified strategy. It is the kind of information that gets passed down through communities by word of mouth, because it is too nuanced to be reduced to simple rules. The moment before detonation, the proximity trigger threshold, defines the most critical zone in a comet encounter. Getting to that range means the machine detonates. Staying outside that range while the comet is in pursuit means it has not yet achieved its objective. The gap between the comet's pursuit speed and the radar's escape speed determines whether that threshold can be maintained. In open terrain, a radar with good situational awareness and early identification of the comet has a reasonable chance of maintaining distance and either escaping entirely or finding an advantageous position from which to engage. In enclosed spaces, that equation shifts dramatically in the comet's favor. Corridors, rooms, and tight passages that are characteristic of urban ruins limit the options for putting distance between you and a pursuing comet in ways that can be genuinely fatal. The ARC's operational preference for urban environments makes this enclosed space advantage significant. A large portion of the encounters radars have with ARC forces happen in and around the remnants of human buildings, where walls, doorways, and debris create the confined geometry that comets excel in. Whether this represents conscious tactical deployment of comets in areas where they are most effective, or simply the correlation between ARC presence and human-built environments, the outcome is the same. Comets are most dangerous in exactly the kinds of places radars most frequently find themselves. Radar tactics for dealing with comets in enclosed spaces tend to fall into three broad categories based on available accounts. The first is aggression, identifying the comet before it identifies you and destroying it from a distance before the pursuit phase begins. The second is evasion, moving out of the enclosed space as quickly as possible when a comet is spotted, accepting the loss of whatever you were doing in there. The third is what might be called controlled escape, using the comet's navigation limitations to direct it through a path that gives you enough time to reach open ground. Each of these approaches has significant risks and requirements. The first requires early detection and sufficient firepower to destroy the comet on its approach before it reaches you. The second requires awareness of exit routes before you enter any space where comets might be present. The third requires detailed knowledge of comet navigation behavior and the terrain, which is not always available. The way the comet behaves when there are multiple radars in proximity is another area where the law and tactical understanding intersect. Interestingly, does it select a single target and commit, or does it respond to the nearest target, or is there some other priority logic? The answer matters because it affects how groups of radars should position themselves when comets are present. If the comet selects the target it first identified and commits to that target regardless of the positions of other radars, then the rest of the group can act more freely. If it prioritizes the nearest target at any given moment, then everyone in the group becomes equally at risk, and positioning relative to the comet becomes critical for all of them. Available evidence suggests the first interpretation may be more accurate, but this is an area where more observation is needed. The detonation itself, when it happens, produces a specific aftermath. The crater left by a comet's seismic explosion is a marker in the environment, evidence that a comet was present and detonated. These craters are informative for subsequent radars passing through the area. They indicate that comets operate in this zone, that at least one detonation has occurred here, and potentially that there was a radar in this area recently who either survived the encounter or did not. Reading environmental evidence is a core skill for radars, and comet craters are a particularly significant piece of evidence because they indicate a specific type of threat that requires preparation and awareness. A radar entering an area with multiple fresh comet craters knows to be on high alert, not just for the ARC generally, but for comets specifically, and can adjust their approach accordingly. The sounds associated with comet behavior are worth discussing because audio is often a radar's first warning of nearby threats. During the roaming phase, the comet produces a specific set of sounds associated with its rolling movement on various surfaces, different from the sounds of other ARC machines. During pursuit, those sounds change in pitch and frequency as the machine accelerates, which is the audio cue that most effectively conveys the urgency of the situation. The moments leading up to detonation reportedly produce a specific sound signature that is distinct from the pursuit approach, a kind of intensification that functions as a final warning that is useful only if you are close enough to hear it, which means you are already in serious danger. This sound, for radars who have heard it and survived, is reportedly one of the most viscerally memorable aspects of a comet encounter. There is a psychological dimension to comet encounters that goes beyond the immediate tactical challenge. The self-destructive nature of the machine, The fact that it is going to end itself in order to end you creates a particular kind of dread that is different from being shot at or chased by a machine that wants to capture you. There is a finality to the comet's commitment that communicates something about how the ARC value this exchange, and feeling that communication in real time during an encounter is deeply unsettling. Raiders who are mentally prepared for this psychological dimension perform better in comet encounters than those who are not, according to the general wisdom that has developed around dealing with this enemy. Being ready for the dread, having processed the implications of what the comet is and what it is doing, allows you to maintain decision-making capability in the critical seconds of a pursuit where an unprepared raider might freeze or make panicked choices. The comet's behavior when it has been significantly damaged but not destroyed is another important operational consideration. Does a damaged comet slow down? Does it maintain its targeting? Does it change its detonation range or threshold? Encounters with damaged comets suggest they maintain their pursuit behavior even when visibly damaged, which indicates a robust and redundant control system that does not degrade gracefully under fire. A damaged comet is still very much a comet. This no degradation of function characteristic is important because it means that shooting at a pursuing comet must be aimed at full destruction rather than incapacitation. There is no middle state where you wing it and buy yourself time through reduced performance. You either destroy it or it reaches you, and the detonation range does not change based on damage. That binary outcome clarifies the tactical situation, even as it makes it more demanding. The relationship between comet density in an area and overall ARC operational intensity is worth noting. Areas with more comets present also tend to have stronger ARC presence in general, which suggests that comets are deployed as part of a larger operational package rather than as a standalone deterrent. This means that the presence of a comet is also a signal that you are in a more heavily contested area, one where the ARC have invested more resources, which carries its own set of implications for raider strategy. Moving through a comet-dense area while also managing the other threats present in that same area is one of the most demanding scenarios in ARC raiders. The cognitive load of tracking comets while also dealing with other ARC machines, managing your own resources, and pursuing whatever objective brought you to that area in the first place is significant. Raids into these areas are not solo endeavors for most raiders. The complexity of simultaneous threat management benefits from the distributed awareness that a group can provide. The comet's lack of ranged attack capability is notable in comparison to most other ARC threats, which typically have some form of projectile weapon. The comet is entirely a melee threat in the sense that it must get close to do anything at all. This means that maintaining distance from a comet is a complete defense against it, in theory. The challenge is entirely in the execution of that distance maintenance against a machine that moves very quickly. This design creates a clean asymmetry in comet encounters. The machine has absolute certainty of outcome if it reaches you, and you have complete safety if it does not. That clarity, that sharp line between safe and dead, is part of what makes comet encounters so tense. There is no partial success state for the comet. It either detonates in your face or it does not. The behavioral routines that govern the comet's search patterns during its roaming phase are worth considering in terms of what they reveal about the machine's sophistication. A truly simple machine would just patrol a fixed path. The comet's irregular but systematic search behavior suggests something more adaptive, a coverage algorithm that prevents obvious gaps in its patrol area and reduces predictability. That adaptive search behavior makes the comet harder to avoid by memorizing a fixed path, which is a strategy raiders frequently use against more predictable ARC units. You cannot simply learn that the comet passes a certain point every 30 seconds and time your movements accordingly. The irregularity prevents that kind of exploitation and forces raiders to engage with the comet's behavior dynamically rather than from a fixed playbook. Over the course of this chapter and the previous one, we have established the comet as a machine with specific design intent, specific behavioral characteristics, and a specific role within the ARC threat ecosystem. What we have not yet fully explored is what the comet's existence suggests about the broader ARC strategy on the surface, and what the community has been able to piece together about where it comes from and what it means for the ongoing conflict. The next chapter will take us deeper into that territory. looking at the comet not just as an individual enemy, but as a piece of evidence in the larger puzzle of what the ARC are, what they want, and how they are pursuing those objectives on a surface that used to belong to humanity. Chapter 4. The ARC Intelligence Question. Who built the comet and why? The question of who or what is directing ARC operations is the central unanswered question of ARC Raiders lore, and the comet sits at an interesting intersection of the various theories that have developed around it. To understand the comet fully, you have to at least engage with the question of what kind of intelligence is responsible for its design and deployment, because the answer to that question changes almost everything about what the comet means. The first and most straightforward theory about ARC origins is that they are purely alien, machines that arrived from somewhere else and began dismantling Earth's civilization, according to a program that has nothing to do with human history or human design. Under this theory, the ARC are simply doing what they were built to do by beings whose motivations we cannot fully understand. And the comet is an expression of that alien design logic applied to the specific problem of dealing with resistant humans. This theory has a lot going for it in terms of explaining the ARC's consistency and the apparent lack of any communicative intent. They do not negotiate. They do not send signals of any recognizable kind. They do not respond to attempts at communication that raiders or other survivors have reportedly made. They simply pursue their operational objectives without apparent interest in anything beyond those objectives. The second major theory is that the ARC are not alien, but rather human-made, an automated system that humanity built for some purpose, and that has either gone wrong, been repurposed, or is executing its original program in ways that were not fully anticipated. This theory is appealing because it explains certain design similarities between ARC aesthetics and human engineering, and because it provides a narrative of hubris and consequences that is dramatically coherent. Under this theory, the comet would be a more recent addition to the ARC's arsenal, developed by whatever automated design and production process the ARC used to adapt to new challenges. If the ARC are a self-improving system, then the comet might represent an iteration of their design approach in response to observed raider behavior, a new tool produced by a machine intelligence that identifies gaps in its existing capability set and fills them. The third theory, and arguably the most unsettling, is that the ARC are a hybrid system, something that began as human-made and then evolved or was modified into something fundamentally different. This theory accommodates both the traces of recognizable engineering logic in ARC design and the genuinely alien aspects of their behavior and objectives. Under this reading, the ARC are not cleanly one thing or another, but something in between, which might explain the inconsistencies that either pure theory struggles to account for. For the comet specifically, the hybrid theory raises interesting questions about at what stage of ARC development it was created. Was it part of the original design, or an evolution? Is it a product of the human-derived elements of ARC architecture, or the more alien aspects? The answer might be visible in the comet's design if we knew how to read it, but that reading is speculative. What all three theories share is an implication about the comet's existence, that something decided a self-destructing sphere that hunts individual humans was a worthwhile addition to the ARC toolkit. That decision, whatever its origin, reflects a level of strategic thinking about the raider problem that goes beyond simple automated threat response. Someone or something looked at the challenge that raiders represent and designed a specific answer to it. The raider problem, from the ARC's perspective, is presumably this: small, mobile human units penetrating ARC-controlled territory, disrupting operations, extracting resources, and acquiring intelligence. These units are difficult to catch with slower machines, difficult to stop with purely static defenses, and dangerous enough that simply ignoring them has costs. The comet is a specifically designed answer to that problem, optimized for the fast, mobile, individual-scale threat that raiders represent. If the ARC are responding to raiders specifically, rather than just clearing the surface of humans in general, that suggests a level of strategic awareness about the underground communities that is deeply concerning. It means the ARC know raiders exist, know what raiders do, and are actively developing countermeasures. That is not the behavior of a system just running a program. That is the behavior of something paying attention. Raiders in the lore of the game exist in a state of tension between necessary activity and the knowledge that their activity is noticed. Every raid that succeeds brings resources back to the underground community, but it also potentially teaches the ARC something about radar tactics. The knowledge that the ARC learn and adapt is one of the things that makes long-term survival genuinely uncertain in this world. The Comet, as a new addition to the ARC threat roster, can be read as evidence of that adaptation in progress. Whether it is a response to a specific radar behavior or a general upgrade in surface denial capability, its existence indicates that the ARC are not static. They are not running the same program indefinitely without revision. They are changing, and that change is driven by something. The possibility that ARC development is ongoing and responsive opens up a particularly grim train of thought for the underground communities. If the ARC develop new countermeasures in response to effective radar strategies, then success breeds its own countermeasure. The more effective raiders become at a particular approach, the more incentive the ARC have to develop a specific response to that approach. This creates a dynamic where raiders must always be evolving their tactics faster than the ARC can respond, which is a race that gets harder to win over time. The Comet's emergence is, under this reading, evidence that raiders have been effective enough at dealing with conventional ARC threats that the ARC needed something new. It is, paradoxically, a sign of raider success as much as it is a new danger. The machine exists because humans adapted well enough to the previous threat environment to require a more sophisticated response. This interpretation frames the Comet not as a sign of ARC invincibility, but as a sign of an ongoing arms race, one in which both sides are actively developing new capabilities. That framing is more hopeful than a narrative where the ARC are simply overwhelming and unresponsive to human resistance, even if the immediate tactical reality of the Comet is dangerous and frightening. The design of the Comet, if we look at it as a piece of ARC engineering, reflects an understanding of human movement patterns and response times. The speed is calibrated to pressure human decision-making. The seismic explosion is designed to negate standard defensive behaviors. The proximity trigger ensures maximum effect on target rather than triggering prematurely. These are not generic choices, they are specific optimizations against human physiology and behavior. That specificity requires knowledge. You cannot optimize against human response times if you do not know what human response times are. You cannot design a seismic explosion to negate standard cover-taking behavior if you do not know what standard cover-taking behavior looks like. The ARC have either built their knowledge of humans into the Comet's design from the beginning, or they have accumulated that knowledge through observation of radar encounters and applied it to new designs. Either way, the Comet represents the application of specific knowledge about humans to a machine designed to kill humans. That is a troubling level of intimacy in the enemy's understanding of its targets, and it is something that raiders who encounter the Comet for the first time are not necessarily prepared for. The machine knows, in a functional sense, how you will respond to it. It is designed around that knowledge. The question of whether the ARC are conscious in any meaningful sense is one that the law does not resolve, and it is probably wise not to try to resolve it here. What we can say is that the behavior of ARC systems, including the design and deployment of the Comet, is consistent with strategic intelligence. Whether that intelligence is conscious, self-aware, or otherwise qualifies as a thinking mind in any philosophically meaningful sense is a different question, and one that may not have a satisfying answer. What matters practically is that the ARC behave as though they are intelligent. Their responses are calibrated to effectiveness. Their designs are optimized for purpose. Their operational patterns are strategic rather than simply reactive. Treating them as though they are intelligent, even if the underlying question remains open, is the correct approach for raiders who want to survive. The Comet's existence fits this model of functional intelligence perfectly. It is not a blunt tool. It is a precise one, designed for a specific purpose and deployed in conditions where that purpose is most likely to be served. Blunt tools do not require intelligence to produce. Precise tools do, or at least they require something that functions like intelligence in all the relevant ways. The community of raiders, and by extension the players exploring the lore, has developed a healthy respect for the ARC as an adversary precisely because of evidence like the Comet. When you encounter an enemy that is clearly adapted to you, that has designed its tools around your weaknesses and behaviors, you are dealing with something fundamentally different from a generic hostile force. You are dealing with something that is engaged with the conflict in a way that requires engagement in return. The ARC's industrial capacity, whatever is driving it, produces machines at a rate that human communities cannot match. The comets are not individually valuable enough to be hoarded or carefully preserved. They are deployed, they find targets, they detonate, and the ARC produce more. This attrition model of machine production versus human endurance is one of the fundamental imbalances in the conflict, and it is one that raiders can work around in individual encounters but cannot fully resolve at a strategic level. Strategic level thinking about the ARC problem is something that the underground communities presumably engage in, but the game focuses primarily on the tactical level of individual raids. The comet's strategic significance, as evidence of ARC adaptation and ongoing development, is the kind of information that strategic planning would need to grapple with, even if we primarily experience the comet at the tactical level of a particular encounter. Lore fragments in the game environment suggest that there were attempts, early in the conflict, to establish some form of coordinated human response to the ARC beyond individual community survival. How far those attempts got, what they achieved, and why the current situation involves dispersed underground communities rather than an organized resistance is part of the larger backstory that the game implies, without fully explaining. The comet's existence in the current threat environment suggests that if those coordinated response efforts happened, they did not decisively shift the balance of the conflict. The ARC are still developing new machines. Raiders are still individual operators, working in small groups. The war, if it can be called that, is ongoing and does not appear to have a near-term resolution on either side. What the comet tells us about the trajectory of that conflict is this: the ARC are still treating raiders as a priority threat worthy of dedicated new development. The conflict is not winding down. It is intensifying, at least in the domain of specialized counter-raider systems. That is the most significant piece of strategic information the comet's existence provides. And it is the kind of information that shapes how we understand where this world is heading. Chapter 5. Raider Accounts. Stories from the Surface. The most vivid and immediate way to understand what the ARC Comet actually means in practice is through the accounts of raiders who have encountered it, or at least the reconstructed accounts that we can assemble from in-game evidence and community observation. These accounts do not come with neat labels or confirmed details, but they carry something important: the texture of what it is actually like to face this machine under real conditions. The first encounter that gets discussed repeatedly in raider communities is not a survival story. It is a death, reconstructed from circumstantial evidence by other raiders who came through the same area afterward. The signs were all there in retrospect: the comet crater, the disrupted terrain, the scattered equipment that tells a story about what happened to the person carrying it. A raider went into an area with a significant ARC presence, encountered a comet before they knew what they were dealing with, and did not make it out. What makes this kind of reconstructed account useful is not the details of the death itself, which can only be inferred, but the evidence left behind. The crater's location relative to cover tells you something about how quickly the comet closed distance. The position of equipment tells you something about the raider's attempt to evade. The absence of certain types of debris suggests the detonation was close enough to do significant damage to anything within range. From these fragments, you build a picture. The first raider known to have survived an encounter with a comet and documented the experience clearly enough to be useful apparently did so through a combination of early detection, significant distance, and what they describe as an extremely fortunate read of the terrain. They were in a position elevated enough above the comet's approach path that the machine's pursuit route took it slightly away from the most direct line, buying enough extra time to destroy it from distance. That account circulated among raider communities because it contained something actionable. Elevation matters. A comet navigating uneven terrain from a lower position to a higher position loses speed relative to flat ground pursuit. The terrain interpretation required for this tactic is not simple, and not every environment provides suitable elevated positions, but the principle of using terrain features to reduce comet pursuit speed became a cornerstone of practical guidance. Later accounts added nuance to this initial principle. Elevation helps, but does not guarantee safety. The comet's terrain navigation is good enough to find routes up to elevated positions even if they are not direct. The angle of the terrain matters, with steeper angles producing more speed reduction than shallower ones. And, critically, the elevated position that slows a pursuing comet also limits your own movement options, so the tactic carries risks of its own. The account that first clearly established the comet's association with larger ARC units came from a raider who was specifically studying ARC deployment patterns, not looking for combat, but for intelligence. They observed a cluster of large ARC machines from a concealed position and noted, over time, the presence of several smaller spherical units moving among them. When another raider came through the area, unaware of the observer's presence, the observer watched what happened. The comet identified the incoming raider well before they reached the main ARC cluster. The pursuit was immediate and fast enough that the raider, who had not yet seen the machine, had almost no time to respond once they registered what was coming. The observer could not intervene in time, but they had recorded what they saw in enough detail that the account of a small sphere associating with larger ARC units and launching pursuit on sight of raiders became part of the collective knowledge base. That observer's account also noted something that subsequent encounters confirmed. The larger ARC units did not appear to mobilize immediately when the comet began its pursuit. They continued their own patrol and operational patterns largely undisrupted. The comet acted as an independent threat rather than a trigger for broader ARC response. This is important tactically because it means dealing with a comet does not necessarily mean also dealing with the larger units near it, provided you are careful about how you deal with it. The acoustic profile of a comet in pursuit mode became important after multiple accounts noted the specific sound of its approach. Raiders who had encountered comets began describing the sound to those who had not, preparing them for recognition before they had their own encounter. This transmission of sensory information, as specific as possible, is a crucial part of raider community knowledge because it converts experience into advance warning. The difficulty of conveying sound through verbal description is significant, but several accounts note that the comet's pursuit sound is distinctive enough to be recognizable once you know to listen for it. It is unlike the movement sounds of other ARC machines, unlike the ambient noise of an ARC-occupied area, and unlike anything in the pre-ARC acoustic environment. It is, in the words of one account, a sound that has no reference point in normal experience, which is part of what makes it so alarming when you hear it. Survival accounts from raiders who managed to destroy pursuing comets rather than simply outrunning them provide some of the most tactically useful information available. The consistent message from these accounts is that the shooting window is narrow and getting narrower as the comet closes distance. You need sufficient firepower, sufficient accuracy under pressure, and sufficient time to land enough hits to destroy the machine before it reaches detonation range. What counts as sufficient varies across accounts, which suggests either that different comets have different levels of durability, or that the conditions of each encounter affect the effective firepower required. The unpredictability of the required firepower is itself a tactical challenge, because it means you cannot be certain that the weapons you are carrying will be enough until you are already in the middle of the encounter. There are accounts of raiders attempting to stop pursuing comets by interposing obstacles between themselves and the machine, essentially trying to block its path. The results are mixed. Solid, heavy obstacles sometimes slow or redirect the comet's approach, buying a small amount of time. Light debris and rubble are largely ineffective because the comet's momentum carries it through or over lower mass objects. And under no circumstances does interposing an obstacle appear to stop the comet entirely. The psychological accounts of comet encounters, the part that deals with how raiders felt during and after the encounter, rather than what they did, are among the most interesting records. The word that comes up most often is commitment, describing the comet's approach. There is something about the way it moves, the absolute directedness of its pursuit, that communicates a level of intent different from other combat situations. It is not shooting at you, it is coming for you, specifically with everything it has, and nothing else matters to it until it completes or fails in that mission. That communicative directedness is not incidental. It is a feature of the comet's design in a very real sense, because that quality of focused, unstoppable commitment creates psychological pressure that affects decision-making. Raiders who felt that pressure and made fear-driven decisions in the critical seconds of a comet pursuit fared worse than raiders who managed to maintain analytical calm. The machine is partly a psychological weapon, and it is a good one. Recovery from a comet encounter, even a successful one, involves a specific kind of decompression that is different from recovering from other combat. The finality of what just happened, the fact that a machine just tried to kill itself in order to kill you, and you survived only by a specific set of choices and actions, has a weight to it that sits differently than surviving a firefight. It is not just that you were in danger, it is that the danger was absolute and specifically directed at you. Raiders who form partnerships and small teams often note that comet encounters are among the most communicatively demanding situations they face. The speed of the encounter means that verbal communication has to be extremely efficient. Longer sentences become nearly impossible in the critical moments. What develops are abbreviated communication systems, shorthand phrases, and signals that convey maximum information in minimum words or gestures. This communication compression is a fascinating social development driven by a specific tactical necessity. The accounts of raiders who lost partners to comets carry a specific grief that is worth noting, not for sentimental reasons, but because it reflects something important about the nature of raider communities. The comet's finality means there is rarely an ambiguous outcome. A raider killed by a comet is not wounded, not captured, not missing. They are gone, completely and immediately. The definitiveness of that loss is different from deaths that involve some prolonged uncertainty, and it shapes how raider communities process grief. For the underground communities receiving these accounts from surviving partners, the death by comet narrative represents something distinct in their accumulated experience of surface danger. The conventional narrative of a raider going to the surface and not coming back usually involves some element of the unknown. What exactly happened, in what circumstances, whether suffering was prolonged. Comet deaths remove that unknown. Something found them and chose to end itself to end them, and that is the complete story. The transmission of comet encounter knowledge from experienced raiders to newer ones is a process that has developed its own protocols in raider communities over time. It is not sufficient to simply describe the machine and its behavior. New raiders need to emotionally process what the comet is before they face it, so that the first encounter is not also the first time they are grappling with the psychological dimension of what it means to be pursued by a self-destructing machine. Advanced preparation for that emotional reality improves performance in the encounter. The communities that have developed the most sophisticated comet preparation protocols are not surprisingly the ones that have had the most exposure to comet encounters in their surface operational areas. This creates an uneven distribution of comet competence among raider communities that reflects the geography of ARC deployment rather than any inherent difference between communities. Those who live above comet-dense areas learn to deal with comets as a matter of course. Those in areas with lower comet presence may be less prepared when they encounter one for the first time. Sharing this knowledge across communities is one of the functions that raider networks serve, and it is one of the reasons why interoperability between raider groups from different communities matters. A raider from a comet-dense area who joins a group from a comet-naive area brings valuable practical knowledge that might save lives. The exchange of this kind of specific, experience-based tactical intelligence is one of the more human and interesting aspects of the world that ARC Raiders constructs. The long-term psychological effects on raiders who have had multiple comet encounters are significant enough to be worth documenting. The hypervigilance that develops around comet detection, the constant monitoring of spherical shapes and rolling movement patterns in peripheral vision, the specific alarm response to certain sounds, these are adaptations that make raiders more effective at detecting comets, but that also carry a cost in sustained cognitive load and stress. Raiders who have been doing this for long enough develop what might be called a second attentional system for comet detection, running beneath conscious awareness and surfacing instantly when relevant patterns are detected. This is a survival adaptation of remarkable efficiency, but it is also a sign of how deeply the comet threat has worked itself into the operational psychology of long-term surface workers. The machine has changed the people who face it regularly, not just their tactics. The mythology that develops around specific comet encounters in raider communities is another fascinating thread. Encounters that were particularly close, particularly dramatic, or that involved unusual circumstances become stories that circulate and are embellished over time. This is not deliberate falsification, but the natural process by which meaningful experiences are encoded and transmitted through oral tradition. The comet occupies a particular place in radar mythology because its encounters have that finality and intensity that make for memorable stories. Some of these stories have crossed into what might be called legend, accounts that are probably based on real events, but have been modified through retelling to emphasize elements that speak to broader themes about survival, courage, and the nature of the conflict. Whether the specific details of these legendary accounts are accurate matters less than what they reveal about how radar communities understand the comet and what it represents. The comet, in radar mythology, tends to represent the ARC's specific animosity toward human presence on the surface. Not the ARC's general operational program, which can be interpreted in various ways, but something that feels almost personal in its directedness. The comet comes for you, not for the infrastructure you are in, not for the area you represent a presence in, but for you. That quality of personal directedness makes it a powerful symbol in narratives about the conflict, even if its actual behavior is purely mechanical. The gap between the mechanical reality of the comet, a machine running a targeting and pursuit algorithm, and the mythological weight it carries in radar communities is instructive. Humans naturally anthropomorphize threats that feel personally directed. We read intent and hostility into behaviors that may be purely functional. The comet's design seems to understand this, whether or not it was intended, and the machine's effectiveness as a psychological threat draws on that anthropomorphic tendency. Chapter 6: The Seismic Explosion, Engineering the Unthinkable. Of all the things that make the ARC Comet distinctive, its method of destruction is the most technically interesting and the most lore-rich. Most ARC weapons produce conventional damage: energy beams, projectiles, concussive blasts. The comet's seismic explosion is different in kind, not just degree, and exploring what that difference implies about the machine's design and purpose reveals layers of meaning that are easy to miss if you are only thinking about it tactically. A seismic event is fundamentally a disturbance that propagates through solid matter. The natural version, an earthquake, is produced by the movement of tectonic plates, releasing stored energy as waves that travel through the Earth's crust. An artificial seismic event, one created by a detonation rather than plate movement, works differently in terms of source, but produces similar propagation through solid material. The waves move through ground, through foundations, through the structural elements of buildings, and through anything connected to those things. The comet's explosion appears to be designed to maximize this ground propagation effect. Rather than releasing energy primarily upward and outward, as a conventional explosive would, the comet's detonation appears to direct significant energy downward and into the ground, converting much of the blast energy into seismic waves that radiate outward from the detonation point through the surface. The practical effect on a human body close to this kind of detonation is severe and differs from conventional blast effects in important ways. Blast waves in air lose energy quickly with distance. Seismic waves in solid material lose energy more slowly over shorter distances and can follow the path of solid material, including floors and walls. A person standing on ground that is experiencing a seismic event is receiving energy through their feet and legs before the air blast arrives, disrupting balance and structural integrity of the body in ways that compound the direct damage. For a person in contact with a wall or floor when a seismic event occurs nearby, the energy transmission through that solid structure can be more damaging than the energy arriving through the air. This is the fundamental reason why standard cover-taking behavior is partially negated by the comet's seismic approach. The wall you are hiding behind is transmitting the explosion into you rather than blocking it. This design insight, if it is intentional, is extraordinarily sophisticated. It requires understanding not just how to create a large explosion, but how human beings respond to explosive threats, what cover-taking behavior looks like, and how to design a detonation that specifically undermines that behavior. That level of specificity points back to the question of ARC intelligence and what they know about human behavior. The secondary effects of a seismic detonation on post-ARC surface environments are significant and worth considering in detail. The surface world is already structurally compromised. Buildings that survived the initial ARC invasion are not in their original structural condition. Foundations may be weakened. Load-bearing elements may be compromised. The buildings are standing, but they are not necessarily stable. A seismic event strong enough to cause significant direct damage to a human at close range is also strong enough to interact with these existing structural compromises in unpredictable ways. A building that was standing before the detonation may not be standing after it, or may be standing in a significantly altered configuration that creates new hazards. Debris that was resting in stable positions may be displaced. Terrain features that provided cover may shift or collapse. This environmental disruption is a secondary but significant effect of every comet detonation, and it extends the danger zone of the explosion beyond the immediate seismic radius. A raider who survives the initial seismic shock by being at the edge of its effective range may still face immediate danger from displaced debris or structural collapse triggered by the event. The fact that the comet destroys itself in the process of detonating means that every detonation is a terminal event for the machine. There is no follow-up. There is no second attack. The comet expends everything it has in a single devastating moment. This all-or-nothing approach to destructive capability is reflected in the design of the explosion itself, which appears to be calibrated to the maximum destructive potential of the energy available to the machine, not held back or rationed for multiple uses. The chemistry or physics of the comet's explosive payload is not specified in the game's available lore, which is appropriate for a game that does not lean heavily on technical exposition. What we can observe is the effect, and the effect is consistent with something designed for maximum energy release in the specific seismic direction. Whatever the mechanism, the design intent is clear. The question of how the comet's explosive payload is stored and contained during the pursuit phase is interesting from a purely engineering standpoint. A machine carrying a significant explosive charge that is capable of producing a seismic event has to manage that payload through rapid rolling movement, potential impacts with terrain features, and presumably the general stresses of high-speed navigation. The payload must be stable during all of that, and then reliably trigger at the moment of proximity detonation. Explosive systems that are designed to be both stable in transit and reliably triggerable on demand are a well-established area of real-world engineering. The challenge scales with the power of the explosive, and the comet's payload is clearly very powerful. Whatever containment and triggering mechanism the ARC have developed for the comet, it appears to work reliably because the machine does not appear to detonate prematurely under the stresses of pursuit. The proximity trigger mechanism specifically is worth examining because it represents a precision requirement that goes beyond simple explosive design. The trigger must activate when the comet is within a specific range of its target, not before and not after. Too early, a trigger detonates in empty space or at range where the seismic effect is insufficient. Too late risks the target having already moved outside effective range. This precision triggering requirement suggests a sensor system that is actively measuring the distance to the identified target in real time and firing the trigger at the moment the distance threshold is crossed. That is a continuous measurement and decision system that must operate correctly under the chaotic conditions of a high-speed pursuit, including the possibility that the target is moving rapidly and unpredictably. The engineering required for this is sophisticated. The implication is that the comet is making a real-time calculation right up until detonation, a live assessment of its distance to target, and a trigger decision made when that assessment crosses a threshold. If the target moves rapidly in the moment before the threshold is crossed, the detonation may occur at a slightly suboptimal range, either too close or too far. This is presumably why some raiders report surviving comet detonations that seem certain to be lethal. The target's last moment movement shifted the relationship between target and detonation point just enough. The sound signature of the detonation itself is distinctive and reportedly unlike anything else in the ARC threat environment. The seismic component of the explosion produces a sound that travels through solid matter as well as through the air, meaning you hear and feel it through multiple channels simultaneously. The combination of the air-transmitted sound with the body-transmitted vibration from the ground creates a sensory experience that is qualitatively different from conventional blast events. Survivors who have been at the outer edge of a comet detonation describe the experience in terms that emphasize the ground-based component as the most disorienting aspect. The air blast you can orient to in the normal way. The ground movement happens beneath you and to you in a way that disrupts your proprioceptive sense of your own position in space. Recovering from that disorientation quickly is a critical survival skill when you are at the edge of a detonation range, because the secondary hazards, falling debris, structural collapse, displaced terrain, require you to be mobile and responsive immediately. The crater produced by a comet detonation is a useful physical record of the explosion. The size and depth of the crater tell you something about the energy released and the direction of that release. A crater that is deeper than it is wide suggests a significant downward energy component, consistent with the seismic optimization of the comet's payload. Craters from conventional explosions tend to be shallower relative to their diameter because more energy goes outward and upward. Radar communities have developed informal methods of reading comet craters that go beyond simply noting their presence. The freshness of the crater, assessed from the edges and from any loose debris around it, gives an indication of how recently the detonation occurred, and therefore whether there is likely to still be a comet in the area. A fresh crater indicates recent comet activity. Multiple craters at different stages of weathering indicate sustained comet presence in the area over time. The scale of the seismic event, as indicated by the crater dimensions and the extent of visible terrain disruption around the detonation point, gives radars an idea of the threat level they should calibrate for in that area. Larger, more destructive detonation evidence suggests either a more powerful comet variant or optimal detonation conditions, and both possibilities should inform the precautions taken in that area. The relationship between the comet's seismic explosion and the ARC's broader apparent interest in subsurface areas is speculative, but worth noting. If the ARC have operational interest in what lies below the surface, specifically in the underground communities that raiders protect and return to, then a machine that optimizes for ground-penetrating destructive energy is interesting in a way that goes beyond just killing individual raiders. This reading is speculative and maybe too much to read into the comet's design. The simpler explanation, that the seismic optimization is specifically about countering cover-taking behavior and the structural instability of the surface environment, is more parsimonious and equally consistent with the observed evidence. But the possibility that the comet's design has implications beyond surface-level engagements is not something that can be fully ruled out. The aftermath of a comet encounter in terms of environmental state is worth documenting because it has implications for other raiders who subsequently pass through the area. The detonation disrupts terrain that was already fragile. The secondary structural effects of the seismic event mean that areas near a detonation point may be significantly more hazardous after the event than they were before it. Cover that existed before may have been destroyed or rendered unstable. Routes that were passable may now be blocked or unsafe. Raiders who move through areas where comet detonations have occurred need to assess the post-detonation terrain differently from how they would assess unaffected terrain. The visual cues of structural damage, settled debris, and altered ground surfaces are important signals that require careful interpretation. Moving through a post-comet area too quickly without reading these signals creates risks that go beyond the comet itself. The temporal sequence of a comet encounter, from first detection through detonation and aftermath, compresses several distinct phases of danger into a very short time frame. First detection, if you are aware enough to catch it, gives you the maximum response time. Transition to pursuit narrows the window. The pursuit itself compresses the decision-making timeline. Detonation is the culmination point, and the immediate aftermath, whether you survived or not, has its own hazards. Managing all of these phases effectively requires a mental model of the comet encounter that is complete enough to guide your actions in each phase without conscious deliberation for each one. Experienced raiders develop this model through exposure. Less experienced raiders are working from an incomplete model and will make some decisions by defaulting to more general instincts, some of which are appropriate and some of which are not when a comet is involved. The explosion's interaction with the ARC's own machines is another behavioral note worth considering. Do the larger ARC units near which comets patrol suffer any effects from a comet detonation that occurs in their vicinity? The answer to this question would tell us something about whether the ARC factor comet detonations into their own deployment spacing. and whether the comet's self-destructive nature is considered from the perspective of protecting other ARC assets. If large ARC units are damaged or disrupted by nearby comet detonations, then the ARC either account for this in their deployment spacing, keeping comets at a distance from other valuable assets, or they accept this as an acceptable cost in the same way they accept the cost of the comet itself. If large ARC units are not significantly affected, then either they have protective measures against seismic events, or the detonation parameters are calibrated to avoid collateral damage to ARC assets. The comet's seismic explosion is, in summary, a design choice that reveals a great deal about the intelligence behind the ARC's machine development. It is not a conventional approach to explosive weapon design. It is specifically optimized for effectiveness against human targets in the conditions that characterize the surface world, accounting for human defensive behaviors and environmental fragility in ways that demonstrate a detailed understanding of both. Whatever produced this design, it understood the problem it was trying to solve. Chapter 7. The Comet within the ARC Hierarchy. The ARC's operational structure on the surface is not flat. Different machine types occupy different functional roles, and those roles relate to each other in ways that reveal an organizational logic worth understanding. The comet, as we've established, tends to cluster near larger ARC units rather than operating independently, and this behavioral tendency positions the comet within a specific tier of the ARC hierarchy. Understanding that hierarchy requires first sketching its overall shape, at least as far as surface observation and radar experience allow. At the top of the hierarchy, in terms of threat and operational significance, are the largest ARC machines, the heavy units that hold territory, protect key installations, and project overwhelming force in contested areas. These are the machines that raiders go to significant lengths to avoid, because engaging them directly is expensive in terms of ammunition, exposure, and risk. Below that tier are mid-range units that serve various functions: patrol, pursuit, coordination, and specialized tasks that support the operation of the heavy units. These machines are individually dangerous, but engageable by skilled raiders who choose their moments carefully. Most of the tactical decision-making in a surface raid involves navigating the presence of these mid-tier machines. Then there is a tier of smaller, more specialized machines that serve specific narrow functions: sensors, scouts, response units, and machines like the Comet that are designed for particular tactical purposes rather than general utility. This tier is where the Comet sits, in terms of size and the specificity of its function. It is not a general-purpose combat machine. It is a purpose-built tool for one specific task. The fact that the Comet stays near the heavy units, rather than independently patrolling with the mid-tier machines, tells us something about the organizational logic of its deployment. It is being held close to the most important assets on the battlefield, the heavy machines, in a position where it can respond to any raider who comes close enough to those assets to be a threat to them. This deployment pattern suggests that the Comet's function is at least partially protective of the heavy units it accompanies, not in the direct sense of covering their flanks or intercepting ranged attacks, but in the sense of ensuring that any raider who enters the vicinity of a heavy ARC unit faces the additional threat of a comet, in addition to the heavy unit itself. The layering of threats in the same physical space makes that space significantly more dangerous to enter. A raider approaching a heavy ARC unit is already in a high-threat situation. Adding a comet to that situation means that the raider must simultaneously manage the threat of the heavy unit with its presumed combat capabilities and the threat of the comet with its self-destructive pursuit behavior. These two threats interact in ways that make each more dangerous than it would be individually. If the raider focuses on the heavy unit, the comet can close distance. If the raider focuses on the comet, the heavy unit is unopposed. If the raider tries to manage both simultaneously, the cognitive load and the physical demands of doing so are at the edge of what most individuals can handle. This is the tactical logic of combined arms applied by the ARC to the specific problem of raider incursion. The heavy ARC units do not appear to have a direct behavioral response to the comet's pursuit or detonation that would indicate a close command relationship. They continue their own operations largely independently when a comet activates. This suggests that the comet is not responding to commands from the heavy unit or acting as its directed weapon. Instead, both the comet and the heavy unit appear to be responding to the same external condition, the presence of a radar, through their own independent behavioral programs. This decentralized response model is interesting from an organizational standpoint because it means the combined threat does not require coordination between units to be effective. The comet does not need the heavy unit to tell it a radar is there. The heavy unit does not need the comet to protect it. Both machines independently respond to the radar, and the result of that independent simultaneous response is a combined threat greater than either machine alone. Decentralized threat systems are robust in a way that centralized systems are not. If you disrupt the command relationship in a centralized system, the subordinate units lose effectiveness. In a decentralized system, disrupting any one unit does not impair the others. The comet's independent operation means that a radar who somehow disables or evades the heavy unit still has to deal with the comet separately, with no reduction in its effectiveness. The question of whether comets communicate with each other in areas where multiple comets are present is directly related to this question of organizational structure. If comets operate completely independently, multiple comets in the same area simply create multiple independent threats that happen to be proximate. If they communicate and coordinate, multiple comets could develop emergent tactical behaviors more dangerous than the sum of their individual parts. Community observations suggest that some degree of coordination may exist between comets in close proximity, at least in the sense that their search patterns seem to avoid redundant coverage of the same areas. Whether this represents active communication or simply a shared algorithm that produces non-overlapping coverage as an emergent property is impossible to determine from observation alone, but the effect is similar in either case. Multiple comets in an area provide more complete coverage than multiple independent machines would. The deployment density of comets in an area appears to scale with the importance of that area to ARC operations. Zones that the ARC defend most heavily also tend to have the most comets present. This scaling relationship suggests that comets are treated as a resource to be allocated based on operational priorities rather than distributed uniformly across the surface. If the ARC have a prioritization system for comet deployment, that system reflects their operational hierarchy in an interesting way. The areas they protect most heavily with heavy units also get the most comets. This doubling down on defense in key areas suggests that those areas matter enormously to whatever the ARC are trying to accomplish. Understanding what those areas have in common, why they merit both the heavy investment in conventional defense and the supplemental investment in comets, is one path toward understanding ARC objectives. The areas with densest comet concentration in the game's environment tend to be associated with specific types of surface infrastructure, certain industrial facilities, certain communication or sensor installations, and areas that have been significantly modified by ARC activity from their pre-invasion state. These shared characteristics suggest that whatever the ARC are doing on the surface involves specific types of facilities and installations, and the comets are protecting whatever is happening there. Raiders who venture into these heavily defended areas are going for the best resources precisely because those areas are important. The correlation between ARC defensive investment and resource value is not accidental. The ARC protect what they value. Raiders go for what the ARC protect. The comets sit at the intersection of that dynamic. The ARC hierarchy's relationship to raiders extends beyond just the comet. The entire defensive architecture of ARC-held zones is organized around the problem of raider incursion at multiple scales. Heavy units hold the perimeter at the macro level. Mid-tier patrols monitor interior spaces. Specialized units like the Comet handle the cases that fall through the cracks of those layers. Individuals who have penetrated far enough into defended territory to be close to something important. By this reading, the Comet's position near heavy units is not just protective in the local sense, but is a final defensive layer before whatever the heavy units are protecting is reached. You get through the perimeter, you navigate the patrol zone, and then you encounter the Comet alongside the heavy unit, a last challenge before the objective. That sequence frames the Comet as a final guardian in the ARC's layered defensive scheme. How the Comet relates to ARC command and control at a higher level is largely speculative. If the ARC have something like a strategic intelligence directing their overall operations, that intelligence presumably made the decision to develop and deploy comets, to allocate them to specific areas, and to establish the deployment density scaling that seems to correlate with operational importance. Those are decisions that reflect strategic thinking, and their existence implies a decision-making process somewhere in the ARC hierarchy. The possibility that comets are produced and deployed automatically by the ARC's industrial and logistical systems without active strategic direction is also consistent with the evidence. A system that produces comets at scale and deploys them in proportion to heavy unit presence would produce the same distributional patterns without requiring active decisions at each step. The strategic pattern would be encoded in the production and deployment rules, rather than requiring real-time strategic direction. Both possibilities, active strategic direction and automated rule following, produce similar observable outcomes. The difference is in the nature of the intelligence involved, and that difference matters for questions about how to disrupt ARC operations at a strategic level, even if it does not change the immediate tactical reality of encountering a comet in the field. The comet's place in the ARC hierarchy is, in summary, that of a specialized tactical asset deployed in support of the most important operational nodes in ARC territory. It is not a general-purpose machine. It is a precision tool allocated to high-value areas where the combination of heavy unit presence and comet threat creates a defensive zone that is exceptionally difficult for raiders to penetrate. Understanding this positioning changes how you think about where you will encounter comets and what those encounters mean for your broader situational assessment. Chapter 8: Theories, Speculation, and What We Still Don't Know. Every time the community develops a confident understanding of some aspect of the ARC comet's behavior or design, another encounter account or piece of environmental evidence surfaces that complicates the picture. This is partly a function of the game's ongoing development, but it is also inherent to the nature of the information available. Raiders observing complex machine behavior under high-stress conditions are not in the best position for controlled observation. The dataset is real but noisy. With that caveat clearly established, there are several active theories about aspects of the comet that remain contested or unresolved. And exploring those theories is worthwhile both because they push the understanding of the machine further and because the questions they raise are often as illuminating as the answers they suggest. The first contested area is the comet's sensory system. We have established that the comet detects raiders and responds to them, but the mechanism of detection remains unclear. One active theory holds that the comet primarily uses thermal imaging, detecting the heat signature of a living human body against the cooler background of a post-ARC surface environment. This theory is appealing because thermal imaging would work in conditions where visual detection would be unreliable, including low light, dust, and the general visual complexity of ruins. A competing theory focuses on movement detection rather than thermal imaging. The comet might be sensitive to the vibrations caused by human movement transmitted through the ground, which would explain both its tracking capability and the seismic theme that runs through its design. A machine optimized for seismic detection and seismic destruction represents a coherent design philosophy built around a particular sensory modality. A third theory combines both. The comet uses multiple sensing modes, with ground vibration sensing as a passive background mode and visual or thermal sensing as the trigger for active pursuit. This multimodal approach is consistent with robust machine design and would explain why raiders who are careful about both their movement and their thermal profile still sometimes seem to trigger comet response. Multiple independent sensing modes are harder to defeat than a single one. The question of comet variance is another active area of community speculation. The game seems to present the comet as a single type, but encounter accounts suggest some variation in behavior, durability, and perhaps explosion scale that could indicate different versions or configurations of the base machine. Whether these variations are systematic, representing distinct manufactured variants, or individual variation within the same model, is unclear. The possibility of elite or upgraded comet variants is particularly interesting from a lore perspective. If the ARC develop machines iteratively, responding to new information and improving their designs, then the comets deployed in areas of highest operational priority might be more advanced than those in lower priority areas. A hierarchical quality distribution in comet deployment would be consistent with the ARC's apparent practice of concentrating their best assets in their most important areas. The question of what happens when a comet fails to detonate, whether through interruption of its approach or some mechanical failure, is also unresolved. Does a comet that was in pursuit and did not detonate simply resume roaming behavior? Does it seek another target immediately? Does it maintain its identification of the target that escaped and attempt to resume pursuit after a delay? These behavioral questions matter for raiders who have managed to evade a pursuing comet and want to know whether the threat is neutralized or simply deferred. Community accounts are inconsistent on this point, which itself suggests variability in the behavior, possibly related to the specific circumstances of the failed detonation. A comet that ran out of pursuit range for an escaped raider may behave differently from one that had its approach disrupted by obstacles. The lack of a clear pattern here is one of the things that makes comets particularly difficult to reduce to a simple rule set. The theory that comets are not individually produced machines, but rather deployed in clusters from a central production unit, is one of the more interesting speculative ideas in the community. Under this theory, there is some kind of comet factory or deployment system at certain ARC installations, producing and releasing comets into the surrounding area. This would explain the clustering of comets in certain zones and the apparent ability of ARC-held areas to maintain comet presence over time, despite detonations consuming individual units. If this theory is correct, the strategic implication for raiders is significant. Finding and disrupting the comet production or deployment system in a given area could reduce or eliminate comet presence in that zone, at least temporarily. This represents a different kind of objective for raiders than simply surviving comet encounters. A target that, if hit, changes the threat landscape for subsequent operations in the area. The question of whether comets have any form of self-preservation behavior is another area of active debate. The machine's design appears to prioritize detonation over its own continued existence, which is the defining feature of its operational logic. But does this mean the comet takes no steps to protect itself during the approach? Does it respond to being shot at by altering its approach path, speeding up, or taking evasive action? Some encounter accounts suggest that comets under fire do accelerate, as though registering damage and increasing urgency in response. Others suggest more deliberate evasive action, changes in rolling path that make it harder to track with aimed fire. If the comet does respond to incoming fire in ways designed to preserve its approach to detonation range, then the decision to shoot at a pursuing comet becomes more complex than just pointing and firing. A comet that responds to fire by accelerating creates a terrible calculus for the raider. Shooting at it buys you less time than not shooting, but not shooting means it reaches you at its approach speed without any reduction. This potential mechanic, if it exists, would represent a sophisticated game theory element built into the machine's behavior. The environmental theory, which holds that the comet is specifically designed to operate in the existing post-invasion surface environment rather than in the pre-invasion environment, has implications for understanding when the comet was developed. A machine optimized for structurally compromised buildings and unstable terrain is a machine designed for the current surface state, not the original surface state. This suggests the comet is not a first-wave ARC weapon, but something developed after the invasion had already substantially reshaped the surface environment. If the comet was developed after the invasion, it is a second-generation or later ARC weapon, adapted to conditions that the ARC themselves created. This timeline positioning makes the comet evidence of an ARC development cycle that is responsive to changing conditions, including changes the ARC themselves caused. That is a level of systemic coherence that is either deeply impressive or deeply troubling, depending on your perspective. The connection between the comet and any specific ARC strategic objective remains one of the largest open questions in its lore. We have established that comets protect important ARC installations. We have suggested that they are a response to the raider problem. We have explored their design philosophy and behavioral logic, but we have not been able to say definitively what the ARC are trying to accomplish that makes these defenses so important in the first place. The ARC's surface objectives, based on their activity patterns, appear to involve some combination of resource extraction, infrastructure establishment, and denial of the surface to human activity. The weight given to each of these objectives varies by area and over time, which suggests a complex operational program rather than a single overriding goal. The Comet serves all three of these objectives in its raider-killing function. It denies raiders access to resources, protects ARC infrastructure, and keeps the surface hostile to human presence. But none of this tells us what the ARC ultimately want, what success looks like from their perspective, or what the endpoint of their program is. The Comet, for all the information it provides about ARC design philosophy and tactical priorities, does not answer the deepest question about the conflict. That question remains open, which is part of what makes the world of ARC raiders such a compelling space for continued exploration. The possibility that the Comet represents a type of machine that the raiders have not yet found a reliable counter to is worth addressing directly. Most ARC machines have established counter strategies that have been refined over time. Some are well understood enough that experienced raiders face them with relative confidence. The Comet's novelty means its counter strategies are still being developed, still being tested, still being argued over in raider communities. This state of incomplete knowledge about how to reliably defeat the Comet is itself significant lore-adjacent information. It tells you something about where the frontier of the conflict is right now. The Comet represents a current challenge that the raider community has not yet fully worked out. And that frontier is where the most active and interesting development in both tactics and lore is happening. The theories about Comet consciousness, or whatever approximation of consciousness might exist in a machine of this design, are among the more philosophical discussions in the community, and probably not worth dwelling on at length. What they reflect is the same anthropomorphic tendency we noted earlier, the human impulse to read intent and inner life into a machine that pursues you with absolute commitment. Whether the Comet experiences anything in any meaningful sense is unknowable and probably irrelevant to surviving an encounter with one. What the Comet knows, in the functional sense of what information it has access to and acts on, is more tractable. It knows the position of its target, updated in real time. It knows its own position and the terrain between itself and the target. It knows its proximity to the target at any given moment and fires when the threshold is crossed. Whether anything else is included in that information set, whether it tracks multiple targets, whether it maintains a memory of encounters, whether it shares information with other ARC systems, these are the empirically relevant, consciousness-adjacent questions. The unknowns about the Comet are as important as the knowns because they define where further investigation would be most valuable. The sensory system, the variant question, the post-encounter behavior, the production and deployment mechanism, the connection to broader ARC objectives. Each of these unknowns is a thread that, if pulled, could significantly advance the overall understanding of what the ARC Comet is and why it exists. Chapter 9. Living with the Comet. Long-term implications for the surface war. The ARC Comet has been part of the surface threat environment long enough now that its presence has begun to reshape how raiders think about surface operations in a systemic way, not just as an individual encounter to prepare for, but as an ongoing factor that affects everything from route planning to equipment loadout to the psychological preparation that raiders undertake before going up. The loadout question is one of the most immediately practical implications. Raiders have always made decisions about what weapons to carry based on the anticipated threat environment. A mission into lightly patrolled territory requires different preparation than one into a heavily defended ARC zone. The Comet adds a specific consideration to that calculation: the need for sufficient firepower to destroy a fast-moving approaching target in a narrow engagement window. This consideration pushes raiders toward loadouts that prioritize certain fire rate and stopping power combinations over others. Weapons that are effective against slower or more distant targets may be less optimal against a Comet closing at high speed. The specific balance of weapon selection for Comet probable environments is an ongoing discussion in raider communities, and one that influences the resource and equipment economy of the underground communities that support raider operations. The psychological preparation component has already been touched on in the chapter dealing with raider accounts, but its systemic implications are worth elaborating on. Communities that have been dealing with the Comet threat for longer have developed more formalized preparation protocols, including what might be described as desensitization training, methods for psychologically familiarizing new raiders with the specific qualities of comet encounters before those encounters happen in the field. These protocols represent accumulated knowledge about human psychology under extreme stress, specifically about what aspects of the comet encounter are most likely to cause decision paralysis and how to prepare against that. They are effective in that raiders from communities with these protocols tend to perform better in their first comet encounters than those without them. They are also resource intensive, requiring experienced raiders to spend time teaching rather than raiding. The opportunity cost of training and preparation is a real constraint for underground communities. Every hour spent on comet preparation protocols is an hour not spent on raids. This creates pressure to make the training as efficient as possible and to prioritize it for raiders likely to enter comet-heavy areas rather than applying it universally. That prioritization requires intelligence about comet distribution on the surface that is not always available. Route planning for surface raids has been significantly affected by comet distribution data, where that data exists. Raiders and communities that maintain records of comet encounter locations can identify zones of comet activity and plan routes that minimize exposure to those zones while still reaching their objectives. This routing intelligence is valuable in the same way that weather forecasting is valuable. It does not eliminate risk, but it allows more informed decisions about which risks to take. The mapping of comet activity zones is an ongoing collective project that raider communities contribute to collectively, adding new encounter data as it becomes available and updating the picture as the distribution shifts over time. The comet distribution is not static. ARC operational priorities change, and comet deployment patterns change with them. A zone that had high comet activity last month may have lower activity this month, or a zone that was clear may have become active. Keeping the map current requires continuous input from multiple sources. This collective intelligence project is one of the more positive examples of human cooperation in the ARC Raiders world. Communities that might be competing for limited resources still share comet encounter data, because the benefit of the shared intelligence outweighs the competitive cost of sharing. The comet threat is common enough and dangerous enough that communities are incentivized to cooperate in mapping it. The long-term psychological effects on raider communities of sustained exposure to the comet threat are harder to measure, but worth considering. Communities in high comet zones live with a qualitatively different relationship to surface danger than those in low comet zones. The knowledge that a machine exists which will sacrifice itself specifically to kill you, and that it is present in the area you have to raid to survive, introduces a specific kind of existential weight into surface operations that accumulates over time. Communities that have developed strong cultural frameworks for contextualizing this weight, for making meaning of the conflict in ways that maintain morale and motivation, tend to sustain raider programs better over time than communities that have not developed these frameworks. The ARC Comet is part of the constellation of threats that these cultural frameworks have to accommodate. And the specific quality of the comet's threat, its personalized directedness, its finality, requires specific accommodation rather than a one-size-fits-all approach to danger. The equipment and technology development implications of the comet threat are another long-term consideration. If the comet's seismic explosion specifically undermines the protective value of conventional solid cover, then developing cover solutions that are less affected by seismic events could be valuable. This is a hard engineering problem under the resource constraints of underground communities. But it is the kind of problem that the threat itself creates an incentive to solve. Portable seismic dampening solutions, if such a thing is achievable with available materials, would change the calculus of comet encounters significantly. Even a partial reduction in the seismic transmission through cover would improve survival odds at the margins of a detonation event. Whether this is achievable is a practical question, but the comet's existence creates the motivation to try. Armor and protective equipment development in raider communities has presumably always been shaped by the specific threats on the surface. The comet adds seismic protection to the list of desired properties, alongside protection against projectile impacts, environmental hazards, and the various specific threats of other ARC machines. The comprehensive protective challenge presented by the full spectrum of ARC threats pushes raider equipment development in directions that would not have been obvious without direct experience. The question of whether raiders can develop effective early warning systems, specifically for comet presence, is directly related to the sensory mechanism question we discussed in the theory chapter. If comets can be detected before they detect you, the safety margin of any surface operation increases dramatically. The challenge is that detection methods have to work without triggering the comet's own detection system, which could mean passive detection only, no active signals that might be picked up by the machine. Passive detection methods that could theoretically work include acoustic monitoring for the specific rolling sound signature of a roaming comet, visual surveillance systems that identify the distinctive shape and movement pattern, and seismic monitoring for the ground vibrations produced by comet movement. Each of these approaches has limitations in the conditions of a surface raid, but each has enough theoretical merit to be worth exploring. The resource economy implications of comet encounters go beyond just equipment. A raider killed by a comet represents a complete loss. Everything they were carrying is gone, in the crater or scattered around it. For communities operating on tight margins, that total loss from a single encounter is significant. The comet's self-destruct mechanism means there is no recovery, no wounded raider to bring back, no equipment to retrieve if the raider managed to ditch it before being caught. Communities have responded to this total loss risk by developing protocols around what raiders carry on high comet risk missions. Loadouts for these missions tend to be more conservative in terms of how much of the community's resources are invested in a single raider. The best equipment may be reserved for missions where the threat profile is better understood and controllable. This risk management approach reduces the upside of high-risk missions, but limits the downside of total losses. The social dynamics within raider groups operating in comet-active areas are shaped by the specific tactical requirements of comet management. Group roles may include a designated comet watcher, someone whose primary responsibility during movement in comet-active zones is visual scanning for spherical shapes and rolling movement near large arc units. This role trades offensive capability and general situational awareness for specialized detection focus. Group communication protocols in comet-active areas are more demanding than in conventional threat environments because the comet's speed compresses the time available for communication. Groups that have trained together in these environments develop abbreviations and code signals that transmit critical information faster than full verbal communication allows. The development of these communication systems is itself a form of adaptation to the comet threat, evidence that the comet is changing how raiders work together. The broader strategic implication of the comet, looking out over the long term of the ARC raiders' world, is that the ARC continue to invest in solutions to the raider problem. They have not decided that raiders are not worth addressing. They have not shifted resources to other priorities at the expense of anti-raider capability. The comet's existence and continued deployment represents an ongoing ARC commitment to denying the surface to raider activity. What that commitment means for the long-term trajectory of the conflict is grim in straightforward terms. The ARC are not going to stop. They are going to develop new counter-raider tools. They are going to get better at the specific problem of stopping human beings from going up to the surface and coming back. Raiders and their communities have to get better faster than the ARC do, or else the trajectory curves toward a surface that is increasingly impenetrable, and underground communities that are increasingly isolated. This is not a hopeless scenario. Raiders have shown consistent adaptability. Communities have shown resilience under conditions that should have defeated them. The underground survives precisely because humans are extremely good at adjusting to new challenges. But the comet is a reminder that adjusting is not enough if the challenge keeps adapting in return. The existence of machines like the comet keeps the question of humanity's long-term future on the surface of their own world genuinely open. There is no guaranteed arc toward reclamation. There is only the ongoing, exhausting, necessary work of surviving today and going up tomorrow, understanding a little more, adapting a little more, and hoping that the accumulated adaptation eventually tips the balance. Chapter 10. What the comet tells us about the future. There is a specific quality to the ARC Comet that makes it more than just another enemy encounter in a game full of enemy encounters. It is a piece of evidence in a larger argument about the nature of the conflict in ARC raiders, an argument about what the ARC are, what they want, and where this is all going. The comet does not answer that argument, but it advances it, and advancing it is worthwhile. The machine's existence, as we have established, points toward an ARC that is actively responding to the radar problem rather than ignoring it. That is the foundational implication from which everything else follows. An enemy that ignores you is very different from an enemy that designs specific machines to deal with you, and the comet is proof of the latter. The next question, once you accept that implication, is what response the ARC will develop after the comet. If the comet is evidence of an iterative development process, a response to observed radar effectiveness against previous countermeasures, then the comet's effectiveness or lack thereof in turn informs whatever comes next. The cycle does not stop with the comet. Raiders and communities who understand this are already thinking beyond the current threat. They are asking not just how to deal with comets, but what comet dealing strategies will teach the ARC that will in turn produce the next generation of countermeasures. That kind of meta-level thinking about the arms race is what distinguishes communities that survive over the long term from those that are always caught flat-footed by the latest development. The comet's specific design innovations, the seismic explosion, the self-destructive pursuit logic, the proximity trigger, point toward ARC engineering capabilities that raiders have not yet fully mapped. There are probably aspects of ARC technical capability that no current threat has revealed, design options that the ARC have not yet deployed because no current radar behavior has made them necessary. Those unrevealed capabilities are the unknown unknowns of the arms race, and they are the most dangerous category of threat. Preparing for unknown future threats is a specific challenge because you cannot train for what you cannot anticipate. What radar communities can do is maintain the general adaptive capacity, the institutional flexibility, the communication networks, the record-keeping practices that allow them to respond quickly to new threats when they emerge. The comet demonstrates that new threats will emerge. Preparation is about being ready to learn and adapt, not about having a solution in advance. The underground community's long-term sustainability depends on a complex set of factors that go beyond just dealing with specific surface threats. Population, resources, knowledge maintenance, social cohesion, all of these are required for sustained survival underground and continued radar operations above. The comet's contribution to the threat environment is one input into a complex equation that the communities are constantly solving. What the comet adds to that equation, specifically, is a mortality rate increase for raiders operating in ARC-heavy areas, with associated resource and personnel losses, a higher cognitive and psychological demand on active raiders, an increased burden on training and preparation systems, and a pressure toward more conservative risk profiles for surface operations that may reduce resource acquisition efficiency. These are real costs to the underground communities, even if they are not catastrophically destabilizing on their own. The question is whether the incremental costs of each new ARC development, including the comet, are accumulating faster than the community's capacity to absorb and adapt to them. If the costs accumulate faster, the trajectory is eventually toward an unsustainable burden. If the communities can absorb and adapt faster, the trajectory is toward survival, and potentially more. The evidence so far, the fact that communities still exist, raiders still operate, and the surface is still being contested rather than entirely ceded, suggests that the adaptation rate has been sufficient. The comet has not broken that pattern, but the pattern is not guaranteed to hold indefinitely, and the comet's existence is a reminder that it is being tested continuously. The raiders themselves, as individuals, carry the weight of this broader strategic reality in their personal choices. Each time a raider goes to the surface, they are contributing to the survival of their community and to the accumulated evidence about ARC behavior that helps all communities understand the threat. Their individual acts of courage and skill are simultaneously personal stories and strategic contributions. The comet tests both dimensions of that dual character. It tests the raider personally, putting them against a machine designed around their own vulnerability, and it contributes strategically. Every encounter that generates useful information about comet behavior adds to the collective knowledge base that communities depend on. Survival is its own contribution to the research. The world that ARC Raiders constructs is one where individual acts matter at a level that is easy to lose sight of when thinking about the scale of the conflict. The ARC are vast, industrial, networked, and relentless. Human communities are small, resource-constrained, and scattered. In that disparity, the individual raider navigating a surface zone where a comet is hunting them represents something almost disproportionately significant. That one human, with their accumulated experience and skill and knowledge in their encounter with one comet in one zone of a ruined city, is the front line of a species' survival. The outcome of that encounter does not determine the war, but the accumulated outcomes of all these encounters, across all the zones and all the raiders, do determine something. They determine whether the sum of human adaptation and endurance is sufficient to the challenge. The comet, for all its lethality and sophistication, has not yet ended that contest. Raiders learn, the knowledge base grows, and the machines, whatever intelligence drives them, continue to develop new answers to the human question on their surface. That cycle, that grinding, consequential, ongoing cycle, is the heart of what ARC Raiders is actually about. Identifying the specific contours of that cycle in a machine like the Comet is worth the effort because it makes the broader story more legible. You see the Comet not just as an obstacle, but as a sentence in a conversation between humanity and something that decided humanity should not have the surface anymore. And you understand that every surviving raider is a reply in that conversation. The Comet exists, it is fast, destructive, and specifically designed to deal with people like the ones going up to that surface every day. It has changed the threat landscape in ways that required real adaptation from real communities with limited resources. It has killed raiders who did not know what it was. It has been survived by raiders who did, or who were lucky enough, or fast enough, or smart enough. It will be joined by whatever comes next in the ARC development cycle, something that responds to the ways in which raiders have learned to handle comets, something that fills the gaps that comet coping strategies leave open. That is the nature of the conflict, and the comet is the current chapter of it. What that next chapter looks like is something no one can tell you yet. What you can do is understand the comet thoroughly enough that when the next thing comes, whatever it is, you have the analytical framework to recognize what it is and what it means. That framework is what this entire video has been trying to build. From the world context in Chapter 1, through the design analysis and behavioral documentation and historical theorizing and strategic implications and personal accounts and the ongoing questions that remain open. A completer picture as the current evidence supports. The comet is not the end of the ARC development story. It is not the most dangerous thing on the surface, and it will not remain the newest thing on the surface. But right now, in this moment of the conflict, it is one of the most interesting and revealing pieces of evidence available about what the ARC are and how they are thinking about the problem of human resistance. Understanding it matters. Going into the surface knowing what it is and why it exists matters. Every bit of knowledge that a raider carries with them changes the probability of their coming back, and changed probabilities, accumulated across enough raiders over enough time, are what survival is made of. That is the argument this video has been making from the first chapter. The comet is not just an enemy. It is a text, and reading it carefully is part of the work of staying alive in a world that is trying very hard to make that impossible. Chapter 11. The comet's place in ARC Raiders as a game. There is a version of this video that only talks about the comet as a lore object, a piece of the fictional world to be analyzed and theorized about, and never addresses the fact that the comet is also a designed encounter in a video game made by real people with specific intentions. That version would be incomplete, because the design of the comet as a gameplay element and the lore of the comet as a narrative element are not separate things. They inform each other in ways that are worth being explicit about. Game design is a form of authorship. When Embark Studios, the developer behind ARC Raiders, decided to include a self-destructing spherical pursuer in their enemy roster, that was not an arbitrary choice. It was a decision that grew out of design goals, player experience goals, and narrative goals. And those goals shaped what the comet is in the lore as much as what it is in the mechanics. Reading the design intent helps you read the lore, and vice versa. The core design challenge that the comet addresses from a gameplay perspective is how to create a threat that is genuinely dangerous to experienced players who have learned to deal with the other ARC enemies. Experienced players in any game develop habits, reliable patterns of behavior that work against the established threats. New enemies that do not challenge those habits fail to register as meaningfully dangerous. The Comet specifically disrupts the habits that work against other ARC machines. The habit of taking cover, for instance, is deeply reinforced by encounters with ranged ARC units that shoot projectiles or energy beams. Cover is the correct response to those threats. The Comet makes cover less reliable than it should be, specifically because its seismic explosion propagates through solid material. The habit is not wrong in general, but it is specifically less effective against this machine, and that specificity creates a moment of genuine vulnerability in experienced players who apply it automatically. The habit of managing distance is another reinforced behavior from other ARC encounters. Keeping a certain range from enemies is generally correct. The Comet weaponizes that approach by closing distance with extreme speed, punishing players who are accustomed to comfortable engagement ranges by collapsing those ranges faster than expected. The comfortable distance is gone almost before you register that it was threatened. These habit disruptions are not arbitrary cruelty on the part of the designers. They represent a deliberate effort to keep veteran players engaged and challenged by ensuring that the game never fully settles into a solved state where established behaviors guarantee safety. A game that can always be solved by the same behaviors is a game that stops demanding engagement from its players. The Comet's self-destructing nature is also a significant design choice from the player experience perspective. In most action games, enemies exist to be killed by the player. The player is the agent of destruction. The Comet inverts this relationship. It is designed to destroy itself, and the player's agency lies in preventing that destruction from happening in their vicinity, rather than in being the one who causes the destruction. That inversion creates a qualitatively different emotional experience of the encounter. When you kill a conventional enemy, there is a moment of satisfaction. The threat is eliminated, you are the cause, you win. When you survive a Comet encounter by escaping or destroying it before it detonates, the emotional register is relief more than satisfaction. You did not exactly win. You avoided losing. That distinction matters to how the encounter feels and how it is remembered, and it contributes to the Comet's ability to create memorable, story-worthy moments in players' experiences. The asymmetry in how you win against a Comet compared to how you win against conventional enemies is also law-consistent in a way that might not be immediately obvious. If the ARC are fundamentally different from human adversaries, their machines should feel fundamentally different to fight. A machine that you survive rather than conquer feels alien in the right way. It feels like fighting something that does not care about the usual terms of engagement, because it does not. The encounter design of the Comet, the sequence of detection, pursuit, and detonation, is a compressed narrative in itself. Every Comet encounter tells a small story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, even if that story plays out in seconds. The beginning is the moment of identification, either yours of the machine or its of you. The middle is the pursuit, where the outcome is still undecided. The end is the detonation, either at your location or in empty ground because you were not there when it triggered. That three-act structure in microcosm is one of the reasons Comet encounters are so memorable and shareable. Players naturally narrate their experiences in terms of what happened and what they did, and the Comet encounter provides a clean narrative arc that is easy to tell as a story. The identifiable beats make it memorable even under the stress of the encounter itself. From a level design perspective, the placement of Comets near larger ARC units in important areas creates a specific kind of zone architecture. The approach to a Comet active area has a different tension than the approach to an area with only conventional threats, because you know that getting close means dealing with multiple simultaneous threat types that each demand different responses. That anticipatory tension is a significant part of the game's tonal palette. The sound design of the Comet, which we have discussed in terms of what the fictional raiders experience, is also critically important from a pure game design standpoint. Audio cues in games serve an informational function. They tell players things about the game state that visual information cannot always convey. The Comet's distinctive audio signature during roaming and pursuit phases is what allows players to build awareness of its presence and state. Good sound design for an enemy like the Comet has to achieve several things simultaneously. It has to be distinctive enough to be recognizable. It has to carry information about state, roaming versus pursuing, through audio characteristics like pitch and intensity. It has to be audible over the ambient sound of the game environment, and it has to create emotional impact appropriate to the encounter, urgency and alarm during pursuit that are physically felt rather than just cognitive registered. The visual design of the Comet also carries game design intent beyond pure aesthetics. The spherical shape is immediately legible as the defining characteristic. This machine rolls. Everything else about its threat follows from that shape. Players encountering the Comet for the first time can make inferences about its behavior from its appearance that are not far from the truth, because the design communicates honestly about the machine's function. This design honesty is a value in game design that is sometimes called readability. The idea that a player should be able to make reasonably accurate predictions about an unfamiliar element based on its appearance. The Comet is highly readable in this sense. It looks like a thing that rolls fast and hits things hard. The seismic explosion is not fully inferable from the visual design, but the general character of the threat, fast and physically impactful, is communicated clearly. The pacing contribution of the Comet to the overall surface experience is worth noting. Surface raids in ARC raiders have a particular rhythmic tension, alternating between careful navigation and intense action. The Comet's sudden activation and rapid approach creates one of the most abrupt pacing shifts in the game, moving from the slow pace of cautious movement to emergency response in a way that is physiologically engaging. Heart rate goes up. Decisions compress. The body responds as though the threat is real. That physiological response is not incidental to the design. It is the goal. A game encounter that produces no physical response is a purely cognitive experience, and purely cognitive experiences are less memorable and less compelling than experiences that engage the body as well. The Comet's design, with its speed and finality, reliably produces physical engagement in players that makes encounters with it viscerally memorable, rather than just intellectually noted. The risk-reward structure of zones where comets are present reflects a design philosophy of proportional challenge. The areas with comets are the areas with the best resources, and that correlation is not accidental. The game is asking players to weigh the value of what they can get against the additional danger of getting it, and the Comet is one of the weights on the danger side of that scale. That risk-reward calculus is also law-consistent. In the fiction of the world, raiders go into more dangerous areas because those areas have better things in them. The ARC defend their most important areas most heavily. The correlation between danger and reward is an emergent property of both the game's design and the fictional world's logic, and the Comet sits at the intersection of both. The community experience of learning the Comet together, sharing encounter data, and developing collective understanding of how to deal with it mirrors the fictional raider communities doing the same thing. This is not a coincidence. Game design that creates problems with emergent solutions that benefit from community knowledge is design that builds the real-world community as an extension of the game's fictional world. The players who discuss Comet tactics online are doing what the fictional raiders do around their underground tables. This design intent to create real-world community around shared challenges is one of the more sophisticated aspects of how ARC Raiders uses its enemy roster. The Comet, as a challenging and somewhat opaque threat, creates a reason for players to talk to each other, to share what they know, to build collective understanding together. The social layer of the game is deepened by encounters that require more than individual understanding to fully grasp. The narrative implications of the Comet within the ongoing development of ARC Raiders are also worth considering from a game design perspective. Games that continue to add content need to introduce new threats that feel meaningful and connected to the established world, rather than arbitrary additions to an enemy roster. The Comet's integration into the existing ARC logic, its behavioral consistency with the ARC's design philosophy, makes it feel like a discovery of something that was always there, rather than an insertion of something new. That quality of discovered inevitability is something that the best game narratives achieve when they expand their worlds. New content should feel like it was always true and you just did not know it yet. The Comet, in how it slots into the ARC ecosystem without requiring any revision of what we knew about that ecosystem, achieves this quality. It did not break the law. It deepened it. For players who are primarily interested in the competitive and tactical dimensions of Arc Raiders rather than the narrative, the Comet represents a pure mechanical challenge that has intrinsic interest. It is an optimization problem with a specific constraint set. Given the Comet's speed, your escape speed, the terrain, and your firepower, what is the optimal response to its identification of you in a given situation? That problem is never exactly the same twice, and working on it is engaging on purely game mechanical grounds independent of the lore. But the lore does something for the tactical engagement that pure game mechanics cannot do alone. It makes the optimization meaningful. You are not just solving a movement and shooting problem. You are surviving an encounter with a machine that chose, in the functional sense, to give its existence for yours. That context colors the tactical experience in ways that make it richer and more emotionally resonant than equivalent mechanical challenges in games without strong narrative foundations. The Comet's design also tells us something about where Embark Studios sees the threat landscape of Arc Raiders going in terms of escalation. The self-destructing kamikaze approach is a significant escalation from machines that simply shoot at you. If the Comet represents a middle stage of Arc threat design evolution rather than an endpoint, then the subsequent stages could introduce threat types that are equally novel in their departure from conventional combat logic. That escalation trajectory is good news for the game's longevity because it implies a design space that has not been exhausted. If the designers are willing to introduce machines as conceptually unusual as the Comet, the threat space of the game is genuinely open-ended, rather than constrained to increasingly powerful versions of established archetypes. That openness is what allows a game's threat landscape to remain genuinely surprising rather than merely more intense. The Comet's role in the game's economy of tension is worth one final observation. Good encounter design modulates tension over the course of a session, creating peaks and valleys that prevent both constant low tension, which becomes boring, and constant high tension, which becomes exhausting. The Comet is a peak tension generator. Its encounters are among the most intense in the game, but they are also brief, which means the tension spike resolves quickly and players return to the lower tension baseline of cautious navigation. That spike and resolution pattern is what makes peak tension encounters emotionally satisfying rather than draining. The Comet gives you 30 seconds of pure urgency and then it is over, one way or another. The contrast between that brief peak and the careful movement on either side of it is what makes the peak feel as intense as it does. Duration and intensity are inverse in good tension design, and the Comet manages this balance precisely. Understanding the Comet as both a design achievement and a lore element enriches both dimensions. The lore is deeper when you understand the design choices behind it. The design is more impressive when you understand the narrative coherence it achieves. The two readings reinforce each other in a way that is one of the hallmarks of game worlds where the mechanics and the fiction are genuinely integrated rather than running in parallel without meaningful connection. Chapter 12: Fragments and Future Threads. The available information about the ARC Comet, as comprehensive as the preceding chapters have tried to be, is still incomplete in ways that point toward future developments in the lore and future areas of investigation for the community. This final chapter is explicitly about those open ends, the fragments that have not yet been assembled into a complete picture, and the future threads that may eventually provide the missing pieces. The most significant open fragment is the Comet's origin story. We have theorized extensively about what the Comet is and why it exists, but we do not have any direct lore evidence about when it was first developed, what specific problem or observation prompted its creation, or what the development process looked like within whatever system produces ARC machines. That origin story would be one of the most revealing pieces of Comet lore if it ever surfaces. The origin question is tied to the broader question of ARC history, which is one of the largest and most intriguing voids in the available lore. What did the ARC look like in the beginning of the invasion? Have they changed significantly since then? What drives the development of new machine types? These questions have general significance beyond the Comet, but the Comet's unusual design makes it a particularly interesting case study for questions about ARC development. Environmental storytelling in games like ARC Raiders sometimes contains fragments of backstory that are easy to miss on a first pass, but reveal important information when examined closely. There may be comet-related lore distributed across the surface environment in ways that have not yet been fully catalogued and interpreted. Scratches in surfaces consistent with comet contact. Unusual patterns of damage in structures that could be attributed to early comet detonations. Configurations of debris that tell stories about encounters not yet fully documented. The practice of looking at familiar environments with new questions is one that the lore community around ARC raiders has proven effective at. The initial body of comet-related environmental evidence was assembled through exactly this process, looking at areas where comets operate and asking what has been left behind that speaks to their presence and behavior. Further passes through these environments with more refined questions may yield additional fragments. The question of whether any survivor accounts exist from the very first comet encounters, before the community had developed any understanding of what the machine was, is one that would provide enormously valuable baseline information. The experience of encountering something completely unfamiliar that then tried to kill you would capture the transition from ignorance to the beginning of understanding in a way that no subsequent account can replicate. If such accounts exist in any form, finding and preserving them is worthwhile. The relationship between comet development and any specific raider tactic or strategy that may have prompted it is another thread worth pulling on. If the comet is a response to something specific, identifying that something would tell us both about ARC design responsiveness and about what raider capabilities looked like before the comet was introduced. The negative space of what the comet was designed to counter is itself a form of information about the state of the conflict at the time of its introduction. The question of whether the comet has any countermeasures designed into it against specific raider anti-machine tactics is related to this. Most purpose-built military systems are designed with awareness of the countermeasures available to the adversary. If the comet was designed in response to a specific raider tactic, it may also have been designed to resist the obvious counter to its own approach. Identifying those designed resistances would complete the picture of the comet as a responsive design rather than a generic one. The comet's behavior in non-standard conditions is another area of incomplete knowledge. How does it perform in environmental conditions that differ significantly from the typical surface terrain? Does extreme weather affect its operation? Does it behave differently in areas of particularly dense arc modification compared to relatively untouched zones? These conditional variations, if they exist, would add significant nuance to the operational picture. The community has documented the comet's behavior in the most common encounter conditions quite thoroughly, but edge cases and unusual scenarios remain less well understood. These edge cases sometimes reveal design assumptions that are not visible in the standard operation of a system, assumptions that can be exploited when the system encounters conditions outside its design parameters. The question of the comet's lifespan and maintenance requirements, if it has any, is interesting from a lore perspective. Most machines require some form of maintenance to remain functional over time. If the comet is deployed and then operates indefinitely without maintenance until it detonates or is destroyed, its design must accommodate that self-sufficient operational requirement. Alternatively, if comets need to return to some form of maintenance station to remain functional, that requirement would create a behavioral pattern that has not yet been clearly documented. A maintenance requirement would also imply that comets which have been roaming for very long periods without opportunity for maintenance might develop behavioral degradations, errors in navigation, reduced sensory acuity, or other signs of operational wear. If such degradation exists, it would be another variable in the tactical assessment of a specific comet encounter. A well-maintained comet and an operationally aged one might represent meaningfully different threat levels. The potential existence of comet variants optimized for different environmental conditions is an extension of the general variant question we raised in the theory chapter. A comet optimized for dense urban environments might have different navigation algorithms or different detonation calibrations than one deployed in open industrial areas. If the ARC tailor their comet deployment to specific terrain types, the variants we encounter in different zones might be genuinely different machines, rather than the same machine in different locations. Identifying these variants, if they exist, requires the kind of careful comparative observation across multiple operational areas that is difficult for individual raiders, but possible for a community that maintains detailed records of encounters across different zones. Cross-zone comparison of comet behavior data is exactly the kind of collective analysis that the community can perform, and individual raiders cannot. The question of what the ARC's response would be to a concerted campaign specifically targeting comet units is one that no raider community has yet been in a position to test at scale. Individual comet kills are common. A systematic effort to eliminate all comets in a specific zone as a prior condition for operating in that zone is a different kind of campaign. And the ARC's response to it, whether they would replenish comets more quickly, deploy heavier conventional units, or develop some other countermeasure, would reveal information about ARC, logistics, and prioritization. The feasibility of that kind of targeted campaign is another question, because it requires committing raider resources to machine elimination rather than resource acquisition, which is an unfavorable exchange in straightforward economic terms. The benefit would be an operational zone temporarily cleared of the specific comet threat, which might enable more efficient resource acquisition in subsequent operations. Whether the investment pays off depends on details about replenishment rates and resource values that are not currently well established. The community discussion around the comet has generated a significant body of creative interpretation that goes beyond tactical analysis into what might be called lore-adjacent speculation. Theories and narratives that are not directly supported by in-game evidence, but that are imaginatively consistent with the established world. These creative interpretations are not without value, even if they are clearly marked as speculation, because they explore possibilities that the game has not foreclosed and that give the world additional texture. The speculative thread about the comet as a weapon of psychological warfare, rather than primarily a physical threat, is one of the more interesting creative interpretations. Under this reading, the comet's design as a machine that pursues and self-destructs is not only about killing the target, but about communicating something to the broader raider community, demonstrating that the ARC will expend resources on individual targets, that no raider is too small a threat to warrant a dedicated response. This psychological warfare reading is speculative, but not implausible, and it connects the comet to broader questions about whether the ARC engage in anything like psychological operations against the human survivors. If they do, the comet's communicative quality, its message that you specifically are worth a machine's entire existence, would be a remarkably effective psychological message, delivered purely through behavioral design rather than explicit communication. The thread about comet populations as environmental indicators is another creative but tractable speculation. If comet density correlates with ARC operational priority, then mapping comet populations over time and tracking changes in that mapping could reveal shifts in ARC strategic priorities before those shifts become visible through other indicators. The comet becomes a kind of strategic indicator, a living map of what the ARC currently consider most worth protecting. This intelligence function of comet mapping, if it can be made reliable, would add a new dimension to the value of comet encounter documentation beyond the tactical value of individual encounter data. The aggregate pattern of where comets are and where they are going would speak to ARC strategy in a way that no individual encounter can. The future development of ARC Raiders lore will presumably continue to add to the comet's story, whether through direct exposition of previously unknown aspects, new environmental storytelling that adds context, or the introduction of related machines and encounters that cast the comet in new light by comparison. Following those developments, with the analytical framework established in this video, should yield continued insight. The most valuable thing that comes out of a deep investigation like this one is not the specific conclusions reached, but the analytical habits developed in reaching them, looking closely at machine design and asking what it reveals about its makers, reading behavioral patterns as encoded logic rather than random activity, treating environmental evidence as a form of text that can be interpreted. These habits apply not just to the comet, but to every aspect of ARC Raiders lore. The comet is, in the end, both a specific thing and an example of a general approach to understanding the ARC. Specific, a spherical, self-destructing machine that hunts individual raiders with dedicated commitment and a seismic explosion. General, a piece of evidence in the ongoing attempt to understand an enemy that does not explain itself and must be understood through its actions and its designs. That dual character specific instance, and general example is what makes spending this much time on a single enemy type worthwhile. You do not just learn about the comet. You learn how to learn about the ARC. You develop a methodology for extracting meaning from incomplete information, for turning behavioral observation into structural inference, for building a coherent picture from fragments. The ARC Raiders world rewards that methodology more than almost any other approach to understanding it. The game does not give you manuals or codexes or explanatory cutscenes. It gives you a world that is legible if you look carefully and think hard about what you are seeing. The Comet is one of the richest texts in that world, and it has rewarded careful reading throughout this video. There are more texts in that world, more machines, more environments, more behavioral patterns, more environmental evidence waiting to be assembled into coherent narratives. The Comet is not the last story this world has to tell, and the analytical work done here is preparation for those future readings as much as it is a conclusion about this one. The raiders who go up to the surface every day are doing a version of the same work. They are reading the world, learning from what it shows them, carrying that learning back to people who depend on it. The video you have just watched is, in a small way, a record of the same process applied at the level of the player community, rather than the fictional raider community. The Comet will keep rolling, raiders will keep learning, the arms race will continue its exhausting, consequential, open-ended run. And the people paying close attention, the ones who care enough to go deep on what a single spherical machine can tell you about the nature of the conflict, those people will keep doing this work because it matters, in the way that understanding the thing trying to kill you always matters. The documentation of the ARC Comet is not complete. It will never be complete while the game continues to develop and the conflict continues to evolve, but it is better now than it was before this video existed, and that incremental improvement in collective understanding is what the whole enterprise is for. Chapter 13. The Physics of Fear. Why the Comet works on a neurological level. There is a reason experienced raiders still feel their pulse spike when they spot a comet transitioning from roam to pursuit, even after dozens of encounters. It is not a failure of composure or a lack of experience. It is the correct biological response to a specific category of threat, and understanding why the comet triggers that response so reliably is one of the more illuminating ways to examine what makes this machine so effectively designed. Human threat assessment operates on two parallel tracks that evolved over millions of years for very different purposes. The fast track, sometimes called the low road in neuroscience, processes incoming sensory information and generates a threat response before conscious awareness catches up. This system is old, evolutionarily speaking, and it is optimized for speed over accuracy. It produces responses in milliseconds by pattern matching against stored threat signatures, and it does not wait for full information before acting. The slow track, the deliberate conscious analysis that generates considered responses, is faster in absolute terms than it was for our ancestors, but still significantly slower than the fast track. It produces better decisions because it has access to more information and more cognitive tools, but it costs time. And time is exactly what the Comet is designed to deny you. The Comet's design, whether intentionally or as an emergent consequence of its function, maps with disturbing precision onto the inputs that most reliably activate the fast threat response in humans. High-speed approach by a solid object on an intercept course is one of the most primitive threat signatures the human nervous system recognizes. Every organism that has ever been chased by a predator has that signature hardwired, because failing to respond to it has fatal consequences that have been editing the genome for a very long time. The Comet is not a predator in any biological sense, but it is doing exactly what a predator does, approaching at high speed on an intercept course with the clear behavioral intent of reaching you. The nervous system does not particularly care that the thing doing this is a machine rather than an animal. The signature is the same, and the response is the same. That automatic biological response, the spike of adrenaline, the narrowing of attention, the acceleration of heart rate and breathing, is what makes the Comet encounter feel as urgent as it does, even when the conscious mind knows exactly what is happening and has a plan. You can know the plan and still feel the fear. And feeling the fear while executing the plan is the core challenge of a Comet encounter in physiological terms. The compression of decision time that the Comet produces interacts with this biological response in a way that amplifies both. The adrenaline response narrows attention and speeds motor responses, but also degrades fine cognitive operations, the detailed tactical thinking that distinguishes expert raiders from panicked ones. The narrow time window means you cannot wait for the adrenaline to metabolize before acting, which means your decisions are being made partly under the influence of a biological state that is not optimized for nuanced tactical thought. This is the specific challenge that Comet preparation training addresses, at least in the more sophisticated forms that experienced raider communities have developed. You cannot prevent the biological response. What you can do is preload enough automated response patterns that the decisions you need to make in a Comet encounter do not require the fine cognitive operations that adrenaline degrades. If the response is sufficiently automatic, the biological state does not impair it. This is the same principle that underlies all high-performance training in high-stress situations, from military operators to emergency responders to competitive athletes. You practice the response until it is automatic enough to survive the degradation imposed by stress chemistry. The Comet encounter is a stress chemistry problem as much as it is a tactical problem. The specific quality of the Comet's approach that makes it particularly activating, compared to a fast-moving threat that simply runs at you, is its combination of speed and inevitability of outcome. Most threats in ARC raiders, once identified, allow for some form of response that keeps options open. You can retreat, find cover, engage, maneuver, but Comet closes options as it approaches. The faster it gets to you, the fewer meaningful choices you have. That narrowing of options is something the nervous system registers as specifically alarming. Option closure, the progressive elimination of behavioral possibilities, is one of the most reliable activators of the fight-or-flight response because it maps onto the phenomenology of being cornered by a predator. Being cornered means that most of the response options that would normally be available are already gone. The system that manages threat response generates proportionally more urgent outputs when option closure is detected, because the time window for any response is finite and shrinking. The Comet is an option-closing machine. Its high speed and the seismic nature of its explosion, which undermines standard cover, combine to remove or reduce the value of the usual responses. You cannot reliably hide. You cannot reliably maintain distance once pursuit has begun from close range. You are left with a smaller option set than other threats leave you with, and your nervous system knows it. The sound design of the Comet, which we have discussed in tactical terms, also has a neurological dimension that is worth addressing. The specific acoustic properties of a rapidly approaching object, the Doppler shift in its sound as it closes distance, the increasing volume and changing character of the sound, are not just informative, they are activating in a deep biological sense because the acoustic profile of an approaching fast-moving object is something that threat detection systems are specifically tuned to. The Comet's pursuit sound, as described by survivors, has a quality that goes beyond the informational. It produces a visceral response that is not just recognition, but alarm, something that the nervous system registers as intrinsically threatening rather than just informationally relevant. Whether this is designed or emergent from the physics of a rolling sphere accelerating across surfaces, the effect is to use the auditory channel to amplify the threat response in exactly the moments when that response needs to be most productive. The aftermath of a Comet encounter, successful or not, involves a specific physiological recovery sequence. The adrenaline metabolizes, heart rate and breathing normalize. Attention widens back to baseline. This recovery takes time, typically several minutes, for the most acute effects and potentially much longer for the more subtle cognitive impacts. Raiders who must continue operating in the field immediately after a Comet encounter are doing so during this recovery period. The decision quality available during this recovery period is different from baseline quality. Attention may be narrowed in ways that persist beyond the most acute phase. Sensitivity to threat signals may be elevated in ways that produce false positives. Fatigue from the energy expenditure of the stress response may be accumulating. These factors collectively mean that the moments immediately following a Comet encounter are not the moments to attempt the most demanding cognitive operations of a surface run. Experienced raiders who understand this physiology build it into their tactical planning. A Comet encounter is not just an event with an immediate outcome. It is an event that has a physiological tail, and that tail has tactical implications for how operations immediately following the encounter are managed. Planning for recovery time after a comet encounter, rather than immediately pressing on to the next objective, is part of expert radar practice in high comet zones. The neurological basis of the comet's effectiveness as a threat has implications for how we understand the ARC's design philosophy. If the comet is effective partly because it exploits deep biological threat responses, then whoever or whatever designed it either understood those responses explicitly or achieved the same result through a different route, perhaps by empirically observing what produces the most effective threat response in humans and optimizing for that effect without necessarily understanding the mechanism. Both possibilities, explicit knowledge of human neurobiology applied to design and empirical optimization through trial and observation, are consistent with the theories about ARC intelligence that we explored in earlier chapters. The ARC understanding human physiology at a functional level, for design purposes, does not require anything more sophisticated than the capacity to run controlled experiments on human subjects, which is a deeply disturbing implication, but a plausible one. The psychological habituation to comet encounters that long-term radars develop is real and significant, but it is also limited. Habituation reduces the amplitude of the automatic threat response through repeated exposure, but it does not eliminate it. The threat signature that the comet presents is too fundamental to be fully habituated out. What changes with experience is the effectiveness of the conditioned response overlaid on the automatic one, the preloaded behavior patterns that execute correctly despite the residual alarm state, rather than instead of it. There is also the question of whether habituation to comet threats has costs in other areas. If the nervous system's threat detection becomes calibrated to comet frequency in high exposure zones, the sensitivity to other threat signatures in those same zones might be affected. This is not well established for the comet specifically, but it is a known phenomenon in threat-dense environments generally, where constant threat exposure can alter baseline sensitivity in ways that have complex effects on performance. The social dimension of fear management in radar groups is worth noting in this context. Groups in which members have normalized discussing their physiological responses to threat encounters, including comet encounters, tend to manage those responses better collectively than groups where such discussion is suppressed or stigmatized. Naming the physiological experience, having a shared language for what a comet encounter does to your body and mind, reduces the cognitive overhead of managing those responses in real time. This social normalization of the physiological reality of threat encounters is part of what distinguishes functional radar groups from groups that fall apart under sustained pressure. The comet, as one of the most physiologically impactful threat encounters on the surface, is one of the central topics in this kind of social processing. The stories radars tell about comet encounters are not just entertainment or tactical intelligence. They are collective processing of shared physiological experience. The relationship between fear and performance in comet encounters is not simply negative. The adrenaline response that the comet triggers does some things that are tactically useful. Motor speed increases, pain sensitivity decreases, certain aspects of physical performance improve. The question is always whether these benefits outweigh the costs in degraded fine motor control and cognitive complexity. And the answer is different for different types of required responses. Physical evasion from a comet, running, changing direction, climbing over obstacles, benefits from the performance enhancements of the adrenaline state. The increased motor speed and reduced pain sensitivity are directly applicable to the demands of physical evasion under time pressure. Precision shooting at a fast-moving target, by contrast, is negatively affected by the same state. This means the optimal response to a comet, from a neurological standpoint, is one that leans toward physical evasion rather than precision engagement, where possible. This neurological analysis of optimal response type aligns with what tactical experience has suggested through trial and error. Getting distance from a pursuing comet, using terrain and movement to survive, is generally more reliable than standing still and trying to shoot it down, except under specific conditions where the engagement geometry is unusually favorable for the shooter. The biology and the tactics point toward the same conclusion by different routes. The fear that the comet generates has a specific quality that distinguishes it from other ARC threat encounters. An understanding that quality requires thinking about the difference between fear of general danger and fear of targeted pursuit. General danger, the sense that the environment around you is hostile and that any number of things could harm you, is the baseline emotional state of surface operations. Targeted pursuit, the specific experience of being chased by something that has identified you personally as its objective, triggers a qualitatively different response. Being individually targeted activates threat responses that are more acute than those produced by ambient danger, because individual targeting implies a machine that will continue to pursue you specifically until it either reaches you or is stopped. There is no randomness in the threat. The comet is not dangerous in the way that unstable terrain is dangerous, in the sense of indifferent physical hazard. It is dangerous in the way that a predator is dangerous, specifically because it has chosen you. The distinction between indifferent and directed threat is one that human psychology handles very differently.